Power, glory, madness. This is the story of how a 16-year-old boy became the most powerful man in the world and how that power consumed him. This is the Mad Conqueror. So sit back and join me as we journey into the past, where myth meets reality and legends come alive. This is Legends from the Past. Let's begin.
Blood splattered across marble as Philip of Macedon, king of an empire, collapsed before his son's eyes. The assassin's blade caught the summer light, a brief flash of silver before guards tackled him to the ground. In that moment, 16-year-old Alexander didn't run to his dying father. Instead, he watched, golden eyes sharp as a falcon's, memorizing every detail of how power changed hands. The great amphitheater erupted in chaos. Nobles scrambled over benches, their fine silks staining, red as they trampled the fallen king's blood. Guards shouted, weapons scraped against scabbards, and women screamed. But Alexander heard something else beneath the chaos. Opportunity. His mother's words from the previous night echoed in his mind. A crown fits better on a head that knows when to bow and when to strike. Olympias had been eerily calm as she'd brushed his hair the night before, her fingers moving with the same deliberate grace she used when handling her sacred snakes. "Tomorrow, my divine son," she'd whispered, "you must be ready. A moment will come when all eyes turn to you. In that moment, you must be neither the grieving son nor the ambitious prince. You must be the king they desperately need." Now, as his father's blood soaked into the white marble steps, Alexander understood. He'd spent years studying battlefield, tactics with his tutors, but his mother had taught him the art of seizing power. The real battle wouldn't be fought with swords, but with carefully chosen words and precisely timed actions in these next crucial moments. Rising to his full height, impressive despite his youth, Alexander's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Guards, secure the exits. No one leaves until we find every last conspirator." The authority in his tone made even veteran commanders snap to attention. He'd practiced that voice countless times, modeled after his father's battlefield commands, but perfected in secret. As the guards moved to obey, Alexander strode to the center of the amphitheater, his crimson cloak billowing behind him. "Noble, people of Macedon," his voice carried to every corner of the vast space, "witness how cowards strike. They attack not on the battlefield where my father made our kingdom great, but here, in a moment of celebration." He knelt beside Philip's body, making sure every eye could see the tableau, the young prince beside his fallen king. When he spoke again, his voice trembled with perfectly measured grief and rage. "My father's blood cries out for justice, and by all the gods it shall have it. But Macedon shall not falter. We are the race of Heracles, descendants of Zeus himself." He rose, drawing his sword in a fluid motion that captured the light. "I swear by the gods, and by my father's spilled blood, those who thought to weaken Macedon today have only ensured its rise to greater glory." The crowd's mood shifted like wind through wheat. Fear transformed into vengeful purpose. Confusion crystallized into certainty. They didn't see a boy of 16 standing before them, but the living embodiment of their nation's strength and continuation. In the shadows of the upper tier, Olympias watched her son with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. Her fingers absently stroked the golden snake bracelet on her wrist, a nervous tell she'd never quite eliminated. Everything hinged on these next hours. She had prepared Alexander for this moment since he first drew breath, whispering tales of his divine destiny into his infant ears, cultivating his natural gifts while carefully nurturing the seeds of necessary ruthlessness. Alexander felt her gaze like a physical touch but didn't look up. He knew his role. As servants moved to cover Philip's body with a purple shroud, Alexander stopped them with a gesture. "Let them see," he commanded. "Let everyone see the price of betrayal." His eyes swept the crowd, marking those who flinched, those who stared too long, and those whose hands strayed too close to hidden weapons. "The conspirators believe they can hide among us," he continued, his voice dropping to a tone that made everyone lean forward to catch his words. "They think themselves clever." "Safe?" A cold smile played at the corners of his mouth, an expression that would become famous in years to come. "They forget that a lion's cub is born with claws." As if choreographed, guards seized 3 men from the crowd, nobles who had been too slow to mask their reactions. Alexander nodded to his captain, Ptolemy, who had positioned his most trusted men during the confusion. The plan set in motion months ago unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. Beneath the calculated exterior, something shifted in Alexander's chest. A dark excitement he hadn't anticipated. The power rushing through his veins felt like wine, like the breath of the gods themselves. In that moment, watching respected nobles being dragged away to what everyone knew would be their deaths, Alexander felt truly alive for the first time. The summer heat bore down on the amphitheater as Alexander moved through the crowd, each step measured and deliberate. Sweat mingled with the metallic scent of blood that hung thick in the air, mixing with the rich perfumes of the nobles and the acrid stench of fear. The sun cast long shadows through the colonnade, stretching across the marble like accusing fingers. Antipater, his father's most trusted general, approached with careful steps. The old warrior's face was a mask of practiced neutrality, but Alexander caught the calculating gleam in his eyes. Here was a man who had served Philip for decades, who had watched Alexander grow from a precocious child into the youth who now stood before him, clothes still spattered with his father's blood. "My prince," Antipater began, then caught himself. "My king, the palace is secured. The assassin is in custody, and we've detained those who might have sympathized with his cause." Alexander noted how quickly the veteran commander had adjusted his form of address. Antipater was always quick to recognize where power lay. And what does our captured friend have to say for himself? He maintains his silence, though not his dignity. Antipater's lip curled slightly. The guards can be persuasive when required. "Bring him to the throne room," Alexander commanded. "I would hear his confession myself." He paused, then added with careful deliberation, "And send word to my mother. She should be present when justice is served." As Antipater withdrew, Hephaestion materialized at Alexander's shoulder like a shadow finding its proper place. His closest friend since childhood, Hephaestion alone seemed unchanged by the day's events, his steady gaze offering the same unwavering support it always had. "They're watching you," Hephaestion murmured, his voice pitched for Alexander's ears. "Alone. Every noble, every soldier, every servant, they're looking for any sign of weakness. Then they look in vain." Alexander's response was equally quiet, but filled with iron certainty. A king cannot afford weakness, especially on his first day of rule. The throne room of Pella was a study in calculated intimidation. Massive columns rose like ancient trees, their shadows stretching across the mosaic floor as the late afternoon light slanted through high windows. Alexander had spent countless hours here as a child, watching his father dispense justice and favor in equal measure. Now he approached the throne, his throne, with measured steps that echoed in the hushed chamber. The assassin knelt before him, flanked by guards. The man's face was already swollen from questioning, but his eyes burned with a fervor that made Alexander lean forward slightly. This was no common murderer. This was a true believer. "You struck down a king in full view of his people," Alexander said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. "Before you die, tell us why." The assassin spat blood onto the mosaic floor. "I struck down a tyrant, one who would sell Macedonia's soul to barbarians and cast aside his true heir for a foreign whore's bastard." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles. Alexander felt rather than saw his mother tense in her position to his right. The assassin's words cut too close to recent events. Philip's marriage to the young Cleopatra, the threat to Alexander's position as heir, the whispered conflicts that had torn the court apart. "So you acted alone?" Alexander's tone was mild, almost conversational. "Out of pure patriotic fervor." The assassin's eyes flickered, just for a moment, to someone in the crowd. Alexander didn't follow his gaze. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. "Bring him," Alexander commanded, gesturing to one of the nobles who had been detained earlier. The man was dragged forward, his fine clothes now dirty and torn. Lord Attalus, one of Philip's most trusted advisors and Cleopatra's uncle. "An interesting coincidence," Alexander said, still in that deceptively mild tone, "that you should be standing so close to where the assassin struck, that your men should be so slow to react, that your niece's claim to produce a pure Macedonian heir should be cut short on this very day." Attalus went pale. "My king, I had nothing to do with—" Silence. Alexander didn't raise his voice, but the word cracked like a whip across the throne room. "I am not my father, Lord Attalus. I do not play games of politics and patience. I am the son of Zeus, and I will have truth." The room grew very still. Even the guards seemed to hold their breath. Alexander rose from the throne, his shadow falling across both the assassin and Attalus. "The truth is written in your eyes, in your trembling hands, in the sweat on your brow. You thought to remove one king and control another, my father's infant son, your own blood, a puppet king for you to rule through." Alexander's lip curled. "How very Persian of you." The insult landed like a physical blow. Attalus flinched, as if struck. "But you miscalculated," Alexander continued, beginning to circle the two men like a wolf around wounded prey. "You thought my father's death would throw Macedonia into chaos. Instead, it has brought clarity. Perfect, crystalline clarity." He stopped behind them, beyond their field of vision. The silence stretched, became unbearable. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the perfect acoustics of the throne room, every word was clear as temple bells. "I sentence you both to death. Not quick death. That would be too merciful. You will die slowly, publicly, as a message to all who would think to strike at Macedonia's heart. But before you die, you will tell us everything. Every name, every plot, every whispered conversation in dark corners. And then those named will join you, one by one, until the roots of treachery are torn from our nation's soil." Alexander returned to the throne, seated himself with fluid grace. "Begin." What followed was necessary but unpleasant. Alexander watched it all with an unflinching gaze, even as some of the nobles had to leave the chamber, their faces green. Olympias remained, her expression one of fierce satisfaction. Only Hephaestion saw the subtle changes in his friend's face, the hardening around the eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the throne's armrests, until the knuckles went white. Names spilled forth like blood from a wound. Conspirators, sympathizers, those who had known and stayed silent. Alexander committed each to memory, watching their reactions in the crowd. Some tried to flee and were cut down. Others fell to their knees, begging mercy. A few stood proud, declaring their loyalty to the true heir, Philip's infant son. Those were the ones Alexander had executed immediately. The rest would face questioning first. As the sun set, casting the throne room in crimson light, Alexander rose. His voice was hoarse from hours of interrogation, but his eyes burned with an inner fire that made hardened warriors step back. "Let it be known," he declared, "that from this day forward Macedonia has one king, one voice, one destiny. Those who stand with me will share in glories beyond imagining. Those who stand against me—" He gestured to the blood-stained floor, where the assassin and Attalus had finally expired under the questioner's attentions. The message was clear enough. Later that night, as celebrations of his ascension echoed through Pella's streets, Alexander stood alone in his father's study. He lifted Philip's royal signet ring from its box, turning it in the lamplight. It was too large for his finger, a fact that would need to be remedied immediately. Every symbol mattered. "A remarkable performance," Olympias's voice came from the doorway. "Your father would have been proud." The words carried a bite of irony that only her son would catch. Alexander slipped the ring onto his thumb, the only finger thick enough to hold it for now. "Father taught me how to conquer kingdoms," he said quietly. "You taught me how to take them." He turned to face her, and Olympia saw something in his eyes that made even her take a step back. "But neither of you taught me how to achieve what I see when I close my eyes. And what do you see, my divine son?" Alexander's smile was terrible and beautiful, like a solar eclipse. "Everything, mother, I see everything." He moved to the window, looking out over the city. Torchlight danced in the streets below, where the celebrations continued, but they carried a frantic edge. Joy mixed with fear, relief tangled with terror. Macedon had lost a king and gained something else, a young ruler whose ambitions would soon outgrow the boundaries of their understanding. "Send word to Aristotle," he commanded, still gazing out at his city, his kingdom. "Tell him I require his presence. There are matters of philosophy we must discuss." "Philosophy?" Olympias's voice held a note of concern. "Now?" "Yes." Alexander turned, and in the lamplight his eyes seemed to glow like molten gold. "I would understand the nature of divinity, Mother. For how can a god rule men if he does not understand what makes him divine?" Olympias felt a chill despite the summer heat. She had raised her son to believe in his divine heritage, had fed him tales of Zeus's blood in his veins, but looking at him now she wondered if perhaps she had done her work too well. "Sleep, my son," she said softly. "Tomorrow brings new challenges." "Sleep?" Alexander laughed, and the sound held no humor. "How can I sleep when destiny calls so loudly?" He touched the ring on his thumb, his father's ring, his ring now. "No, Mother, sleep is for mortals. And as of today, I am something more." The night deepened over Pella, and with it came whispers of change. In taverns and noble houses, in barracks and temples, people spoke in hushed tones of the day's events. They spoke of Philip's death, of course, but more than that, they spoke of his son, of the way he had taken control, of the cold fire in his eyes, of the ruthlessness with which he had crushed opposition. A new sun was rising over Macedonia, a brilliant, terrible sun that would cast light and shadow across the known world. And in his father's study, surrounded by maps and scrolls and the ghostly wisdom of dead kings, Alexander began to plan. The world, he decided, was too small. He would have to make it larger. As dawn approached, Hephaestion found his friend still awake, poring over maps of Persia. Alexander didn't look up as his oldest companion entered, but his voice held a new note, something between excitement and fever. "Do you see it, Hephaestion? Do you see how small they've made the world? How they've drawn borders and walls where none should exist?" Hephaestion moved closer, concerned by the wild light in Alexander's eyes. "You should rest, Alexander. The day has been long." "Rest?" Alexander looked up then, and his smile was radiant and terrible. "How can I rest when every heartbeat brings us closer to destiny? Look." He swept his hand across the map, across nations and empires drawn in careful ink. "All of this waiting, all of this ours for the taking. Father thought too small, dreamed too small, but I—" He pressed his hand flat against the parchment, as if he could feel the pulse of distant lands through the paper. "I will remake the world in my image." Hephaestion watched his friend carefully. He had known Alexander since they were boys, had seen every facet of his personality, but this was something new, something dangerous and glorious and frightening. "The men will follow you," he said carefully, "but they need time to adjust to your rule, to trust in your leadership." Alexander's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Trust? They don't need to trust me, my friend. They need to believe in me. And after today—" He touched the signet ring again, a gesture that was already becoming habitual. "After today, who could doubt?" The first light of dawn crept through the windows, painting the study in shades of gold and shadow. Alexander stood, his movement sudden and decisive. "Send for the generals," he commanded. "All of them. It's time they understood what it means to serve a god." Hephaestion felt a chill at those words, but he bowed and went to do as his king commanded. Behind him, Alexander turned back to his maps, his fingers tracing paths that would soon be written in blood across the face of history. The sun rose on a new era. Macedonia had lost a king and gained something far more dangerous. A young ruler who believed himself divine, whose ambitions knew no bounds, and whose destiny would reshape the world. The mad conqueror's reign had begun. But madness, like greatness, takes time to reveal itself fully, and in those early hours of Alexander's rule, even those closest to him could not guess how high he would climb, or how far he would fall. The die was cast. The gods, if they were watching, must have smiled their cruel smiles, for they knew, as perhaps Alexander himself knew in some deep corner of his soul, that destiny's price is always paid in blood. And blood, as Macedonia would learn, was something their new king would never hesitate to spend. The infant's cry shattered the night, like glass breaking on marble. In the flickering torchlight of Cleopatra's chambers, Alexander watched his half-brother squirm in his mother's desperate embrace. The child, barely old enough to crawl, had Philip's eyes. That, more than anything, sealed his fate. "Please," Cleopatra whispered, backing away from Alexander's advancing guards. Her silk robes caught the torchlight, transforming her into a creature of gold and shadow. "He's your father's son. Your own blood." Alexander tilted his head, studying her with the detached curiosity of a hawk examining wounded prey. "My father had many sons," he said softly. "Too many." His voice carried none of the theatrical passion he'd displayed in the amphitheater. This tone was different, intimate, almost gentle. Somehow that made it worse. The room stank of fear and spilled wine. Earlier, when his men had burst in, Cleopatra had been drinking, trying perhaps to dull the terror of waiting for this moment. The goblet lay overturned now, its contents spreading across the mosaic floor like blood. "You don't have to do this," she tried again, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. "We could leave, disappear to the edges of the empire. You'd never hear from us again." A smile touched Alexander's lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Those remained fixed on the child, calculating, measuring. "You're right," he said. "I don't have to do this, I choose to." He stepped closer, letting the torchlight illuminate his face fully. A lion that wishes to lead the pride must first eliminate all rivals, even the cubs. The guards moved with practiced efficiency. They had done this before in the hours since Philip's death, dealing with other potential claimants, other branches of the family tree that needed pruning. Some had been quick, others less so. Cleopatra saw something in Alexander's eyes then, something that made her stop pleading. Instead, she drew herself up, every inch a queen, and spat in his face. "Your father was right about you," she hissed. "You're your mother's creature, a snake wearing human skin." Alexander wiped the spittle from his cheek with deliberate slowness. "No," he corrected her. "I am something far worse. I am a god who has learned to taste blood." The child's final cry was mercifully brief. Later, as dawn painted the sky in shades of flame, Alexander stood at his window, watching smoke rise from the pyres burning beyond the city walls. The night's work had been thorough. No rival claimants remained, no threats to his rule, no loose. "And is it done?" Olympias's voice came from the doorway. She had not participated in the night's events, but Alexander knew she had been awake, waiting, counting the deaths like beads on a prayer strand. "It's done." He didn't turn from the window. "The line is secured. The throne is safe." She moved, to stand beside him, her presence as familiar as his own shadow. "You did what was necessary, what Philip himself would have done, had positions been reversed." "No." Alexander's voice was distant, thoughtful. "Father would have exiled them, kept them as pieces in his political games. This," he gestured to the rising smoke, "this is something new, something more absolute." Olympia studied her son's profile in the growing light. She had raised him to be exceptional, had fed him tales of gods and heroes with her milk. But looking at him now, she saw something that even she hadn't anticipated, something that made even her serpent's heart skip a beat. "The generals are waiting," she said finally. "Your first war council as king." Now Alexander smiled, and there was nothing distant about it. This was the smile of a predator scenting blood on the wind. "Then let's not keep them waiting. There's so much to discuss." The council chamber was thick with tension and stale air when Alexander entered. Generals who had served his father for decades, men who had watched him grow from a child into the youth who now commanded their loyalty, shifted uneasily in their seats. They had all heard about the night's work. Some had participated, others had merely listened to the screams. Antipater, ever the practical one, spoke first. "The army is restless, my king. They need to know the succession is secure. Then, let us secure it properly. Alexander moved to the head of the table but did not sit. Instead, he began to pace, his energy filling the room like storm clouds gathering before lightning strikes. Tell me, my father's friends, what did Philip promise you? What glories did he dangle before your eyes? The generals exchanged glances. Finally, Parmenion, oldest and boldest of them, answered. Persia. He spoke of uniting Greece and striking east, of avenging old wrongs and winning new territories. Alexander's laugh was sharp as a sword's edge. Persia, he thought too small. He swept a hand across the maps spread on the table. I see beyond Persia, beyond the known world itself. There are empires waiting to be born, kingdoms yet undreamed of. And you, his eyes blazed with an inner fire that made hardened warriors want to look away. You will help me forge them. The men follow strength, Clytus the Black rumbled from his corner. Show them you're worthy of your father's mantle, and they'll follow you to Hades itself. Worthy? Alexander's smile turned cold. I will make them forget my father's name. By the time I'm done, Philip will be remembered only as the man who sired a god. A murmur ran through the room, part shock, part fear, part growing excitement. These were men who had built their lives on warfare, who understood power in its rawest forms. And here before them stood power incarnate, wrapped in youth and burning ambition. There will be changes, Alexander continued, his voice taking on the cadence of command. The army will be restructured. New tactics, new weapons, new ways of making war. Those who adapt will prosper. Those who cling to old ways... He let the threat hang unspoken. One by one, the generals pledged their loyalty. Some meant it. Others merely mouthed the words while calculating odds and planning contingencies. Alexander noted them all, filing away each reaction, each hesitation, each too eager promise. But it was Hephaestion, standing silent in the shadows, who saw the true cost of the morning's triumph. He alone noticed how Alexander's hand trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, how his friend's eyes held a new darkness, as if something fundamental had shifted in the night's bloody work. The council dispersed, leaving Alexander alone with his closest companion. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of the night's actions hung between them like an unsheathed blade. They're afraid of you now, Hephaestion said finally. Even the ones who've known you since you were a child. Good. Alexander's voice was weary but satisfied. Fear builds better empires than love. And what of those who love you? What are we to feel? Alexander turned to his friend then, and for a brief moment, the mask slipped. Underneath was something raw and vulnerable, a glimpse of the boy, who had woken to find himself king, who had ordered deaths and felt pieces of his own humanity die with each command. Feel pride, he whispered. Feel awe. Feel whatever you must, but never pity. A god has no use for pity. Hephaestion stepped closer, close enough to see the dried blood still caught under Alexander's fingernails. And is that what you are? Now? A god? I am becoming one. Alexander's voice held absolute conviction. With each death, each decision, each step away from what I was, I move closer to what I must be. The world will not be changed by men, my friend. It must be reshaped by something greater. As if to punctuate his words, a fresh wave of wailing rose from the city below. Another body had been found, another family discovering the price of being too close to power's shifting currents. The day wore on, filled with the 1,000 tasks that come with securing a new reign. Alexander moved through them with fluid grace, as if he had spent years preparing for each moment. In a way, he had. Every lesson, every observation, every quiet. Study of his father's methods had led to this, but it was the feast that night that truly marked the beginning of his reign. He commanded it be held in the same hall where Philip had died, the bloodstains still visible on the marble, despite the servants' best efforts to scrub them clean. The symbolism was deliberate. Let them feast where death had walked. Let them drink while remembering how quickly power could shift. Alexander presided from his father's seat, wearing his father's rings, drinking from his father's cup. But there was nothing of Philip in the way he watched his guests, Nothing of the old king's boisterous charm in his calculated smiles. The wine flowed freely, too freely. Tongues loosened, guards dropped, and Alexander observed it all with sharp-eyed focus. Each careless word, each drunken confession, each nervous glance was noted and remembered. Some of those who feasted that night would not live to see the next summer. "You see how they drink to forget their fear?" Olympias murmured from her place beside him. "How they laugh too loudly and agree too quickly." "I see everything, mother." Alexander's voice was soft but carried an edge of something new, something that made even Olympias pause. "I see those who truly support me, those who merely pretend, and those who plot even now against me. I see the ones who will die tomorrow, next week, next month. I see the future writing itself in wine and blood." As if to demonstrate, he beckoned to a young noble who had been drinking heavily all evening. The man approached the high table, with obvious trepidation, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Tell me," Alexander said pleasantly, "what news from your estates near the border? I hear there's been some interesting traffic lately." The noble's face went pale beneath his wine flush. He had been passing information to potential rivals, thinking himself too minor to notice. Now he stood before his king, seeing death in that pleasant smile. My king, I can explain." "No need." Alexander waved a generous hand. "Have more wine. Enjoy the feast. Tomorrow is soon enough for explanations." The man retreated, shaking. He would try to flee in the night. Alexander's men would be waiting. "You're enjoying this," Hephaestion observed quietly from his right. "The power to decide life and death with a word." "Enjoying?" Alexander considered the question as he watched another noble drink himself into oblivion. "No, I'm fulfilling my nature. A lion doesn't enjoy the kill, it simply does what it was born to do." The night wore on, the hall growing warmer and louder with each passing hour. But Alexander remained cold and sharp as a blade, cataloguing every weakness, every opportunity, every thread that could be pulled to unravel potential opposition. Near midnight, he rose suddenly, silencing the hall with a gesture. Every eye turned to him, every breath held waiting for his words. This was what he had been born for, this absolute command of attention and fear. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "We feast tonight in the shadow of grief, celebrating life while death's echo still rings in our ears. Some might call this disrespectful." His smile was brilliant and terrible. They would be wrong. He lifted his father's cup, the gold catching, torchlight like captured fire. "We feast because life demands it, because power flows like wine, and those who would drink deep must first prove their worth at the table." His eyes swept the crowd, lingering on certain faces. Some of those he gazed at longest seemed to shrink in on themselves. "Tonight we are all friends." The emphasis he placed on tonight sent a shiver through the assembly. Tomorrow brings its own tests, doesn't it?" He drained his cup in one long swallow, then hurled it against the wall with explosive force. The crash made everyone jump, wine running down the marble like blood. "To the future," he roared, and the hall roared back, fear and excitement mingling in their voices. Later, much later, Alexander stood alone in his chambers, stripped of his finery, looking at his reflection in a polished bronze mirror. The face that looked back was both familiar and strange, still young, still beautiful, but changed in ways that went beyond flesh and bone. "What do you see?" Hephaestion asked from the doorway. "Destiny." Alexander traced his own features in the mirror. "Do you know what Aristotle taught us about the nature of gods? That they are beyond human concern, beyond human feeling." "Yes." Alexander's smile was distant, dreamy. "Beyond love, beyond fear, beyond mercy, pure purpose, pure power." He turned from the mirror. "I felt it today, when I ordered the deaths, when I watched them burn. There was nothing human in me. Then, nothing weak or hesitant or unsure." Hephaestion moved closer, concern evident in his eyes. "You are human, Alexander. Human greatness is enough." "No." Alexander's voice was soft but implacable. "It isn't. Not for what I see coming. not for what must be done. He reached out, touched Hephaestion's face with gentle fingers. "You're the last tie I have to that humanity. The last one who sees me as I was, not what I'm becoming." "And what are you becoming?" Alexander's hand dropped away. "Something necessary, something terrible, something that will change the world so completely that they'll have to invent new words to describe it." He turned back to the mirror, his reflection ghostly in the pre-dawn light. "The universe demands balance, old friend. Great glory requires great horror. I will give them both." The sun rose on a changed Macedonia. The old power structure had been torn down and rebuilt in a single night of blood and fire. Those who survived would tell their grandchildren about it, about the night the young lion showed his teeth, about how power shifted like quicksilver in young hands that never trembled. But none would speak of what that power cost. None but Hephaestion, who watched his friend drift further from humanity with each passing hour, and wondered if godhood was worth the price of a soul. The dawn painted Alexander's chambers in shades of gold, but he had no time for beauty now. There were orders to give, executions to arrange, a kingdom to reshape in his image. The work of becoming divine had only just begun, and somewhere in the distance, destiny waited with bloody hands and a crown of thorns, ready to lead him down paths from which there would be no return. Thebes burned like a sacrifice to dark gods. The ancient stones, weathered by centuries of sun and storm, glowed red in the inferno as Alexander stood atop its broken walls. Below him, 6,000 citizens lay dead or dying, their blood turning the Boeotian soil to mud. The screams of the living mingled with the roar of flames, creating a symphony of destruction that made his pulse quicken. "Please," a young woman's voice cut through the chaos. She stood in the ruins of what had been the city's main square, holding a child above her head like an offering. "Are you not ashamed before the gods?" Alexander gazed down at her, his golden eyes reflecting the flames. In the flickering light, he looked more demon than man, more force of nature than mortal king. "The gods!" His voice carried easily over the crackle of burning timber. "I am the god of Thebes now, and I have judged it unworthy." With a gesture, he signaled his archers. 100 bowstrings sang in unison. The woman's body joined the thousands already cooling in the evening air, her child still clutched in death's embrace. Alexander watched them fall with the detached interest of a philosopher observing a natural phenomenon. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said to Hephaestion, who stood rigid beside him. "How quickly centuries of pride can turn to ash." Hephaestion's face was streaked with soot and something that might have been tears. "These were Greeks, Alexander, our own people." "No." Alexander's smile was terrible in the firelight. "These were rebels who thought they could defy a god. Now they are an example." He raised his voice, letting it carry to the troops below. "Let every city in Greece hear what happened at Thebes. Let them know the price of defiance." The destruction had begun at dawn. Thebes, proud and ancient, had refused to bend the knee to Macedonia's young king. They had called him a usurper, a bastard, a boy playing at kingship. They had expected mercy, the usual diplomatic dance of siege and negotiation. Instead, Alexander had brought them apocalypse. His new tactics had shocked even his veteran commanders. No slow encirclement, no chance for surrender. His troops had struck like lightning, using the devastating phalanx formations he had modified for urban warfare. The Theban defenders, expecting traditional siege tactics, had been overwhelmed in hours. But it was what came after that would be whispered about in terrified tones across Greece for generations. "Take everything," he had commanded, as the walls fell. "Every life, every treasure, every stone. I want nothing left of Thebes but a memory of fire." Now, as evening painted the sky the color of bruised flesh, that command was being fulfilled with mechanical precision. His Macedonian troops, initially hesitant to slaughter fellow Greeks, had quickly learned that hesitation earned their king's displeasure. And Alexander's displeasure had become something soldiers feared more than death. Ptolemy approached, his armor splattered with blood and worse. "The temple of Apollo still stands, my king. The priests claim divine protection." Alexander's Laugh was sharp as broken glass. Divine protection? Let's test that claim. He descended from the wall with fluid grace, picking his way through the rubble like a deity surveying its domain. His guards followed, their torchlight casting twisted shadows on the smoke-stained stones. The temple rose before them, its white marble columns now grey with smoke. Priests stood on the steps, their robes pristine despite the chaos around them. Their high priest, an elderly man with eyes like aged copper, stepped forward. "This is Apollo's house," he declared, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Even kings must bow to the gods." Alexander mounted the steps slowly, deliberately. Each footfall echoed in the sudden silence that fell over the watching soldiers. When he reached the priest, he stood eye to eye with the old man, close enough to smell the incense that clung to his robes. "You speak of gods," Alexander said softly, almost gently. "Let me tell you of divinity, priest. It is not found in marble halls or golden statues. It lives in the power to unmake worlds." His hand shot out, grabbing the priest's throat. "Your Apollo sits silent while his city burns. What kind of god is that?" The priest's eyes bulged as Alexander's fingers tightened. "The gods will punish the gods!" Alexander lifted the old man off his feet, with inhuman strength born of rage and madness. "I am the only god here." He hurled the priest down, the temple steps. The old man's neck snapped with a sound like a branch breaking in winter. "Burn it," Alexander commanded. "Burn it all." His men hesitated for just a moment, enough for him to turn, eyes blazing. "Did I stutter? Burn it." Halting, they rushed to obey. Oil was brought, torches were thrown. Soon the temple of Apollo joined the rest of Thebes in flames, its marble columns cracking in the heat, its treasures melting into rivers of gold and silver that ran between the cobblestones like metallic blood. Alexander stood in the heart of the inferno, unbothered by the heat, watching centuries of history turn to ash. His expression was one of pure ecstasy, a man witnessing the fulfillment of some dark prophecy. "Send messengers," he commanded, never taking his eyes from the flames. "To every city in Greece. Tell them what happened here. Tell them that Thebes defied Alexander and Thebes ceased to exist." He turned to his generals, his smile radiant and terrible. "Tell them their choice is simple, kneel or burn." As night fell fully, Alexander walked the ruins of what had been one of Greece's proudest cities. The fires were dying now, having consumed everything that could burn. The dead lay where they had fallen, men, women, children, all equal in death's democracy. His boots left bloody footprints on ancient stones. Hephaestion found him in what had been the agora, standing amid the wreckage of market stalls and everyday lives. "The men are asking if we should begin burying the dead." "No." Alexander's voice was distant, dreamy. "Let them rot. Let their bones bleach in the sun. Every traveler who passes this place should see what defiance costs." "Alexander," Hephaestion's voice cracked slightly. "These were civilians, merchants, craftsmen, children. They were fuel." Alexander turned to his friend, his eyes reflecting starlight and ember glow. "Fuel for the fire that will forge a new world. Every great change demands sacrifice, my friend. Every new order rises from the ashes of the old." He began to pace, his energy barely contained, like lightning in a bottle. "Do you know what I saw as the city burned? I saw the future, a future where the whole world speaks one language, follows one law, bows to one king." His smile was fever bright. "My language, my law, my divine will." "At what cost?" Hephaestion whispered. "Cost?" Alexander laughed, the sound echoing off broken walls. "What is cost to a god? The universe demands balance. Great glory requires great horror. I will give them both in equal measure." A cry rose from the ruins. Someone still alive, trapped beneath fallen stones. Alexander cocked his head, listening with almost scientific interest. "You see, even in death they serve my purpose. Their screams will echo across Greece, teaching others the price of resistance." He strode toward the sound, his movements precise and predatory. The survivor was a young man, barely more than a boy, pinned beneath a fallen column. His legs were crushed, but his eyes were clear as he looked up at his king. "Mercy," he gasped. "Please." Alexander knelt beside him, gentle as a lover. "Mercy? Yes, I suppose I could be merciful." His hand caressed the boy's cheek. But then how would others learn? The dagger was in his hand and through the boy's heart in one fluid motion. The hardest lessons require the clearest examples. He rose, wiping his blade clean on his cloak. "Have the surviving women and children sold into slavery," he commanded the nearest officer. "Except for the priests and priestesses, they rejected my divinity. They can join their gods in the afterlife." Dawn broke over the ruins of Thebes like nature herself was ashamed to illuminate the destruction. Alexander stood on a hillside overlooking the city, watching the sun paint the ruins gold. Behind him, his army was preparing to march, their next target already chosen. "The delegates from Athens have arrived," Ptolemy reported. "They wish to discuss term." Alexander's smile was cold as mountain snow. "Terms after this." He gestured to the smoking ruins below. "There are no terms. There is only submission or annihilation. Let them choose." The Athenian delegates found him there, still gazing over his handiwork like an artist admiring a masterpiece. They were politicians, used to the delicate dance of diplomacy. The sight of Thebes had stripped them of their usual eloquence. "Great king," their leader began, his voice trembling slightly. "Athens wishes to express its loyalty." "Loyalty?" Alexander turned to them slowly, deliberately. "Loyalty is proven through actions, not words. You supported Thebes in their defiance. You thought to play the old games of alliance and counter-alliance." His smile made them step back involuntarily. "Those games are over. The rules have changed. I have changed them." He began to pace before them, every movement calculated for maximum effect. "There will be no more independent cities, no more separate laws, no more local gods." His voice took on the cadence of prophecy. "There will be one empire, one law, one king. Those who accept this truth will prosper. Those who resist," he gestured to the ruins below. The delegates fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the blood-soaked earth. Alexander watched them grovel with the same detached interest he had shown the dying. These men, who had once debated with kings as equals, now crawled before him like worms after rain. "Rise," he commanded finally. "Go back to your city. Tell them what you've seen here. Tell them that Alexander of Macedon sends them a choice, glory or ashes. They have 3 days to decide." As the delegates hurried away, Hephaestion approached. He had not slept, had not eaten, had done nothing but watch his friend transform into something terrible and magnificent. "You enjoyed it," he said quietly. "Not just the victory, the destruction, the death." "Enjoyed?" Alexander considered the word like a philosopher examining a new concept. "No, I transcended it. In those flames, I became something more than human, something necessary." He turned to his oldest friend, his eyes fever-bright. "The world is changing, Hephaestion. The old ways are burning away, and from those ashes I will forge something glorious and terrible." The army began its march south, leaving Thebes to its ghosts and ravens. But the smoke from its ruins rose high into the clear Greek sky, a warning and a promise to all who saw it. Alexander of Macedon had come into his power, and mercy had burned away in the flames of his ambition. Greece would never be the same. The world would never be the same. A god walked among men, and his footsteps left fire in their wake. In the days that followed, city after city sent delegations bearing submission and tribute. They had heard the tales of Thebes, had seen the smoke on the horizon. None wished to test whether Alexander's appetite for destruction had been sated, but those who looked closely, who dared to meet those golden eyes, saw something that terrified them more than any physical threat. They saw purpose. They saw destiny. They saw a man who had touched divinity in the flames of Thebes and found it to his liking. The mad conqueror had taken his first true steps toward legend, and the cost had been only 6,000 souls, one ancient city, and the last traces of his own humanity. The gods, if they were watching, must have wept. or perhaps they merely nodded in recognition of one of their own, ascending through blood and fire to take his place among them. Either way the die was cast, the conquest had begun, and nothing in the world would ever be the same again. Blood turned the Granicus River crimson as Alexander drove his horse straight into the Persian line, his sword cleaving through armor and flesh with inhuman precision. 3 men died in as many heartbeats, their screams lost in the thundering chaos of battle. Persian arrows darkened the sky like a storm of locusts, but Alexander rode on, laughing as death itself seemed to recoil from his advance. Behind him, 20,000 Macedonians watched their king challenge the gods and win. The river ran swift and deep, its current strong enough to sweep armored men to their deaths. But Alexander's white stallion seemed to dance across the Chi, water, each step precise as a surgeon's knife, each leap carrying its rider into the heart of the enemy. For Macedonia! His voice carried over the din of battle clear as temple bells. The sunlight caught his golden armor, transforming him into a figure of living flame. For glory! The Persian nobles manning the riverbank were among their empire's finest warriors, men who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of killing. They faced Alexander's charge with the confidence of veterans who had broken armies before. Their curved swords flashed, their spears thrust forward in perfect formation. It should have been suicide. Everyone who witnessed it, friend and foe, alike knew they were watching a man ride to his death. But Alexander was no longer just a man. His sword moved faster than human eyes could follow, deflecting spears, shattering blades, opening throats. Each strike found a vital point. Each movement flowed into the next like water, like dance, like destiny itself, made manifest in flesh and steel. "The king is possessed!" The cry rose from the Persian ranks. "He fights like Ahriman himself!" A Persian axe caught Alexander's helmet, splitting it nearly in two. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. 20,000 Macedonian throats caught their breath. Even the river seemed to pause its eternal flow. Alexander ripped off the ruined helmet, revealing a face transformed by battle fury into something terrible and beautiful. Blood ran down his cheek where the axe had grazed him, but his smile was radiant as sunrise. "Is that all?" he shouted at his would-be killer. "Is that all your gods can muster?" The Persian noble had a moment to regret his accuracy before. Alexander's sword removed his head from his shoulders. It flew in a perfect arc, splashing into the river's crimson flow. "Forward!" Alexander's voice took on the timbre that his men had learned to recognize, the battle song that meant their king had passed beyond mortal constraints. "Show them what it means to face the sons of Zeus!" The Macedonian phalanx crashed into the river like an avalanche of bronze and iron. Men fought and died in the rushing water, their bodies swept downstream where carrion birds already gathered. The noise was apocalyptic, screaming horses, clashing metal, the prayers and curses of dying men in a dozen languages. But above it all rose Alexander's laughter. Hephaestion, fighting at his king's side as he had since they were boys, saw something new in his friend's eyes, something that made even him, who knew Alexander better than any living soul, feel a chill despite the summer heat. The battle became a slaughter. The Persian line broke like pottery under a hammer, their legendary cavalry retreating in disorder. Alexander led the pursuit personally, running down fleeing nobles with the methodical precision of a hunter culling prey. Only when the sun began to set did he finally rein in his horse. His armor was painted red from helm to greaves, his sword, arm so drenched in gore it appeared to be made of living ruby. But his eyes burned with an inner fire that made hardened warriors look away. "A good day's work," he said to his generals as they gathered around him. His voice was conversational, as if they'd spent the afternoon at a sporting match rather than killing thousands. "Though hardly the challenge we were promised. My king," Parmenion, oldest and most experienced of his commanders, spoke carefully. "The men they're saying no mortal could have survived that charge. They're saying the gods themselves turned aside Persian blades." Alexander's smile was knife-sharp in the fading light. "And what do you say, old friend?" "I say I've never seen anything like it in 40 years of warfare." "Perhaps." Alexander dismounted with fluid grace, seemingly untouched by the day's exertions. You've simply never seen a god make war before. He strode through the battlefield like a lord inspecting his estate, pausing occasionally to finish. Off wounded enemies with casual efficiency. His men parted before him, many dropping to their knees. They had entered the battle following a king. They had emerged serving something else. In his tent that night, Alexander stood before a polished bronze mirror, examining the wound where the Persian axe had split his helmet. The cut was shallow, already scabbing over, but he studied it with intense fascination. "It should have killed you," Hephaestion said from the entrance. "That blow should have split your skull like ripe fruit." "Should have." Alexander traced the wound with a finger. "But the gods protect their own, don't they? The men are talking. They're saying Zeus himself deflected the blade. Let them talk." Alexander turned from the mirror, his eyes fever-bright in the lamplight. Faith is a more powerful weapon than any sword. He began to pace, his energy barely contained, like lightning in a bottle. The battle fury had not left him. If anything, it seemed to have intensified with the coming of night. "Did you feel it, old friend, when we crossed the river? When their lines broke?" His voice took on a dreamy quality. It was like stepping into another world, like becoming something more than flesh and bone. "I felt you nearly die a dozen times." Hephaestion's voice was sharp with worry. "I saw you take risks no sane commander would consider." "Sane?" Alexander laughed, and there was something in the sound that made even Hephaestion's flesh crawl. "Sanity is for mortals. I am becoming something else, something necessary." He stopped pacing suddenly, turning to face his oldest friend with burning intensity. "The men understand, even if you don't. They saw today what it means to be led by divinity. Did you hear them cheering as we rode down the Persian dogs? Did you see how they fell to their knees when I passed?" "I saw men in awe of incredible courage and skill," Hephaestion said carefully. "I saw a brilliant commander inspire his troops." "You saw the beginning." Alexander's smile was terrible and beautiful. "Today was just the first step. There will be more battles, more victories, more moments when the divide between God and man grows thin." He gripped Hephaestion's shoulders with hands that burned like brands. "I will show them such wonders, my friend. I will remake the world in fire and glory." Before Hephaestion could respond, a commotion rose outside the tent. Ptolemy entered, his face grave. "My king, you should see this." They emerged to find the army in an uproar. The river, still running red with battle's aftermath, had begun to glow. Thousands of tiny lights danced on its surface, reflecting the starlight like diamonds scattered on blood. "A sign!" The cry went up from 1,000 throats. "The gods! Bless our victory!" Alexander stood watching the phenomenon, his face illuminated by the strange light. Those close enough to see his expression would later swear they saw something divine in his smile. "Do you still doubt?" he asked Hephaestion softly. "Do you still think this is merely human?" Later they would learn that the lights were some natural occurrence, certain tiny creatures that sometimes bloomed in the river's waters, but by then it didn't matter. The story had already spread through the army like wildfire. Alexander had turned the river to blood with Persian deaths, and the gods themselves had come to admire his handiwork. The next morning, Alexander ordered the dead Persian nobles beheaded, their bodies left for the vultures. It was not the Macedonian way. His father had always treated fallen enemies with respect. But Alexander was creating his own traditions. And now, "Let them rot," he commanded when Parmenion objected. "Let all of Asia see what defiance costs." He had the heads collected and arranged in a vast circle, faces turned outward as if watching the horizon. In the center, he conducted a sacrifice to Ares, the blood of the offering mixing with the battlefield's dried gore. His men watched in uneasy silence. This was not the Greek way. This was something older, something that whispered of ancient rituals and darker gods. But when Alexander emerged from the circle of dead faces, his armor gleaming in the morning sun, they cheered. He had led them to victory against impossible odds. He had survived blows that should have killed any mortal man. Who were they to question his methods? The army began its march inland, leaving the Granicus and its ghosts behind. But something had changed, not just in their king, but in how they saw him. The story spread and grew with each telling, how he had laughed in the face of death, how his sword had moved faster than human eyes could follow, how the gods themselves had turned aside Persian blades. Alexander encouraged the tales, but, in private moments, those closest to him saw something troubling. He no longer slept more than an hour or two at a time. His energy was manic, inhuman. He would pace his tent all night, plotting battles yet to come, seeing victories in his mind's eye with such clarity that they seemed more real than the present. "The veil is thinning," he told Hephaestion during one of these midnight sessions. "The barrier between what I am and what I'm becoming grows weaker with each victory." "And what are you becoming?" Alexander's smile was distant, dreamy. "Something magnificent, something terrible, something necessary." He turned to his maps, his fingers tracing paths across Asia. "This is just the beginning. Wait until you see what comes next." The campaign continued, and with each victory the legends grew. Alexander seemed to know exactly where enemy forces would be, as if the gods themselves whispered intelligence in his ear. His tactical innovations shocked both friends and foes. No one had ever seen warfare conducted with such brilliant, terrible efficiency. But it was more than just military genius. There was something in how he carried himself now, something in his voice and manner that made hardened warriors tremble. When he spoke, men found themselves believing impossibilities. When he commanded, they rushed to obey without question. The Persian Empire had never faced anything like him. They had fought Greeks before, had dealt with ambitious young kings and brilliant generals. But Alexander was something new under the sun, a force of nature wrapped in human flesh, a god of war who walked among men. After each battle, he became a little more remote, a little less human. His laughter, once warm and infectious, took on an edge that made even his friends uncomfortable. His anger, always quick to spark, became something apocalyptic. One evening, a young officer made the mistake of questioning one of his tactical decisions. Alexander had him stripped naked and staked out under the desert sun. The man's screams lasted 2 days before death finally took him. "A necessary example," Alexander told his horrified generals. "The divine will cannot be questioned." None dared object. They had seen what he could do on the battlefield. They had seen the impossible become commonplace under his command. If he said he was divine, who were they to argue? But Hephaestion saw the cost. He saw how each victory, each claim of divinity, each moment of inhuman brilliance carved away another. Piece of the friend he had known since childhood. The Alexander who had laughed with him, who had shared dreams and fears, who had been gloriously, wonderfully human. That Alexander was dying by inches, being replaced by something both more and less than human. "Do you remember when we were boys?" he asked one night, finding Alexander again sleepless, poring over maps by lamplight. "Do you remember reading Homer together, dreaming of glory?" "Dreams." Alexander looked up, and his eyes were strange in the flickering light. "I don't dream anymore, old friend. I see, I know. The future unfolds before me like a scroll, written in fire and blood." He rose, moving to the tent's entrance where the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. "We read of gods and heroes, you and I. We wondered what it would be like to walk among them." His smile was radiant and terrible. "Now I know. And soon, so will the whole world." The army marched on, deeper into the heart of Persia. Behind them tales spread like wildfire. Tales of a golden-haired god-king who could not be killed, who turned rivers to blood with his victories, whose laughter made hardened warriors weep. Alexander encouraged the stories, but he no longer needed to embellish them. Reality had become more fantastic than any tale. He had crossed the line between human and divine, and he was never coming back. The world would never be the same. A god walked among men, and his footsteps left fire in their wake. The mad conqueror had truly begun his ascent to divinity, and the price would be paid in rivers of blood. Vultures circled against the molten copper sky as another soldier collapsed into the endless sand, his desiccated corpse joining the trail of dead that marked Alexander's march to divinity. The Libyan. Desert devoured men with methodical cruelty. First their water, then their strength, finally their sanity. But Alexander pressed on, driven by voices only he could hear, following a pair of ravens that his men swore were sent by Zeus himself. The oracle of Siwa waited, and with it, confirmation of his godhood. "Water!" the cry rose from the ranks, more plea than demand. "My king, we need water!" Alexander turned in his saddle, his golden hair crusted with sand, his eyes burning with fever-bright intensity. The desert sun had scorched his men black as Ethiopians, had cracked their lips, and withered their flesh. But Alexander seemed untouched by mortal concerns, as if the merciless heat only fed the divine fire growing within him. "Water!" His laugh was sharp as a blade's edge. "The gods have no need of water. And we—" His smile was terrible in the shimmering air. "We are becoming gods." Behind him, Ptolemy exchanged worried glances with Hephaestion. They had lost a third of their expedition force in just 4 days. Men who had survived the bloodbath at Granicus, veterans of a dozen campaigns, simply dropped in their tracks, their bodies mummifying instantly in the desiccating wind. But Alexander showed no sign of turning back. If anything, the deaths seemed to drive him forward with greater urgency. Each fallen soldier was one less mortal witness to his transformation, one less human tie holding him to earth. The ravens led them deeper into the wasteland, their black wings stark against the bleached sky. Some men whispered that the birds were demons leading them to doom. Others claimed they were Zeus's own messengers, guiding his son to destiny. None dared voice their doubts where Alexander could hear, not after what happened to the last man who suggested retreat. The screaming had lasted hours, echoing across the dunes until the desert wind finally swallowed it. Now the man's bones lay somewhere behind them, one more marker on their road to madness. As the sun reached its zenith, the air itself seemed to burn. Men began to see things that couldn't exist. Gardens blooming in the sand, rivers flowing uphill, armies of shadows marching just beyond the horizon. But Alexander rode on, his back straight as a spear, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "There." His voice cut through the heat shimmer like a bronze knife. "Do you see it?" At first they saw nothing but more endless sand. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from the haze. Columns rose like the fingers of buried giants. Ancient walls, weathered by millennia of sand and wind, caught the sunlight like polished bone. Siwa, the oldest oracle in Africa, sacred to Zeus Ammon, keeper of secrets that predated the pyramids themselves. Alexander's horse quickened its pace, sensing its rider's excitement. The ravens wheeled overhead, their harsh cries driving men to their knees in superstitious terror. The temple complex emerged fully from the heat haze, a sprawl of sandstone and marble that seemed to defy natural law. No mortal hands could have raised such stones in this desolate place. No human vision could have conceived such architecture. As they approached the main gate, priests emerged to greet them. Their robes were white as sun-bleached bones, their faces hidden behind masks of gold and ivory. They moved with the fluid grace of serpents, their feet seeming barely to touch the scorching sand. "Welcome, son of Philip," their leader intoned, in accented Greek. Or should we say, son of Zeus? Alexander dismounted with fluid grace, his boots raising little puffs of dust from the ancient stones. "You know why I've come. We know many things." The high priest's mask caught the light, momentarily blinding those who looked directly at it. "The question is, are you prepared to know them too? Take me to the oracle." Alexander's voice carried absolute authority, despite his parched throat and sun-cracked lips. "I would speak with my divine father's prophet." The high priest's masked face tilted slightly, studying the young king with the dispassionate curiosity of a hawk examining wounded prey. "The oracle does not receive supplicants until the new moon." "I am not a supplicant." Alexander's hand fell to his sword hilt, an unconscious gesture that made his guards tense. "I am a god, coming to claim his birthright." A whisper ran through the assembled priests, like wind through dead leaves. The high priest remained motionless for a long moment, the eternal desert sun beating down on them all with devastating indifference. Finally he nodded. "Follow." They entered the temple complex through gates older than history. The temperature dropped immediately, blessed shade replacing the murderous sun. The air smelled of ancient stone, incense, and something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of Alexander's neck rise. Power, old power, sleeping in the stones like a coiled serpent. The priests led them through a maze of corridors, their footsteps echoing strangely off walls carved with symbols no living scholar could read. Alexander's men, those who had survived the desert crossing, huddled together like frightened children. Even hardened veterans who had laughed in the face of Persian arrows found themselves whispering prayers to gods they'd long forgotten. But Alexander strode forward as if he owned the place, as if these ancient halls were simply waiting for his arrival. His eyes burned with fever-bright intensity, taking in every detail, every shadow, every whispered echo. The inner sanctum, when they reached it, was both more and less than they had expected. No gold, no jewels, no obvious signs of divine presence, just a circular chamber carved from living rock, its walls sweating moisture that somehow survived. The desert's thirst. In the center, a natural fissure in the ground released vapors that made the air shimmer like heat waves off sand. The oracle herself was ancient beyond reckoning, her skin like papyrus, her eyes filmed over with white. She sat on a three-legged stool above the fissure, swaying slightly as the vapors wreathed around her. "Leave us," Alexander commanded his men. Even Hephaestion, who had never left his side in battle, found himself retreating before the power in that voice. The oracle spoke first, in a language dead before the pyramids were built. The high priest translated, his masked face turning between them like a weather vane seeking wind. "She says you have walked a long road to reach a longer one." Alexander stepped forward, close enough to feel the strange vapors touching his skin. "Ask her what she sees when she looks at me." More of the ancient tongue, whistling like wind through empty tombs. The high priest seemed to hesitate before translating. "She sees double, man and god, mortal and divine, casting a single shadow. And which am I truly?" The oracle's blind eyes fixed on Alexander with unnerving accuracy. Her next words made the high priest take an involuntary step backward. She says you are what you choose to be, but choose carefully. Gods cannot unmake themselves." Alexander laughed, and there was something in the sound that made even the ancient oracle flinch. "I chose long ago. I chose when I first heard my mother's stories of Zeus visiting her as a serpent. I chose again at Granicus, when Persian blades turned aside from my flesh. I choose now, and I choose divinity." He moved closer still until he stood at the very edge of the fissure. The vapors wrapped around him like loving arms, and those watching would later swear his eyes began to glow with an inner fire. "Ask her what Zeus Ammon would have his son do." The oracle's response was immediate, requiring no translation. She reached out with one withered hand and touched Alexander's forehead. The contact lasted only a moment, but Alexander's reaction was explosive. He threw his head back, his body arching as if struck by lightning. A sound emerged from his throat, not quite a scream, not quite a laugh, but something that contained elements of both. The vapors seemed to pour into him, filling him with whatever ancient power slept in these stones. When he finally straightened, his eyes were changed. Those who saw him in that moment would never forget it. The moment a man became something else, something more and less than human. "I understand now," he said, but his voice was different, resonating with harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate in sympathy. "I see it all." The high priest fell to his knees, his mask clattering to the floor, forgotten. The oracle herself had collapsed backward, caught by attending priests who seemed to materialize from the shadows. Alexander turned to the door, knowing his men waited beyond. "Bring them in," he commanded. "Let them see what their king has become." When the Macedonian officers filed back into the chamber, they found Alexander transformed. He stood in the center of the room, the mysterious vapors swirling around him like a cloak. The oracle's priests lay prostrate on the ground, their foreheads pressed to the ancient stone. "Kneel," Alexander said softly. It was not a request. One by one they dropped to their knees. Even Hephaestion, who had known Alexander since they were boys, found himself unable to resist. There was something in his friend's presence now that demanded submission, that reached past conscious thought to touch something primitive and fearful in the human brain. The oracle has confirmed what we all knew. Alexander's voice filled the chamber, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I am no mere king, no simple conqueror. I am the son of Zeus Ammon, chosen to unite all lands under divine rule. He began to pace, his footsteps leaving brief flares of light on the ancient stone. The time of small kingdoms is over. The age of divided peoples ends here. I will forge a new world, where all bow to a single divine will. Not a man present doubted him. They had seen too much. The impossible victory at Granicus, the supernatural survival of the desert crossing, and now this transformation in the world's oldest oracle. If Alexander said he was a god, who were they to argue? But Hephaestion, watching from his knees, saw something that the others missed. For just a moment as Alexander turned, there was a flicker of uncertainty in those changed eyes. A brief glimpse of the human still trapped inside the divine, screaming to get out. Then it was gone, replaced by the burning certainty of godhood. The journey back across the desert was different. The heat seemed less intense, the distance shorter. Water appeared where no water should be, and not a single man died despite the brutal conditions. More tales for the growing legend, more proof of divine favor. Alexander rode at the head of the column, his back straight as a spear, his eyes fixed on something beyond mortal sight. He barely spoke, barely ate, barely slept. When he did speak, his voice carried harmonics that made men's bones vibrate, and their minds cloud with religious awe. The army that reached Memphis was changed. They had left Macedonia following a brilliant young king. They returned serving a living god. Alexander's first act upon reaching the city was to order the construction of a new type of altar, one that combined Greek and Egyptian elements with his own image at the center. The priests of Memphis, reading the political winds with ancient skill, immediately proclaimed him pharaoh and son of Ammon. But it was in his private moments that the full impact of Siwa became clear. I can see it all now, he told Hephaestion late one night, pacing his chambers like a caged lion. The patterns, the connections, the threads of destiny weaving together. It's so clear. What's clear? Hephaestion asked carefully. He had learned to be cautious with these midnight conversations. Everything. Alexander's laugh was wild and beautiful. Why men fight, why empires fall, why the gods themselves bend reality to their will. I understand it all, and I can use it. He stopped pacing suddenly, turning to face his oldest friend with eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to something beneath. The oracle showed me the truth. Reality is malleable. Gods shape it by will alone. And I... His smile was terrible in the lamplight. I am becoming very, very good at willing things into being. Hephaestion watched as Alexander resumed his restless movement, his bare feet leaving brief after-images on the marble floor. The man he had grown up with, the friend he had loved like a brother, was disappearing piece by piece. Something else was taking his place, something magnificent and terrible, something that made even the most hardened warriors tremble. The changes became more pronounced with each passing day. Alexander began wearing Persian robes mixed with Egyptian regalia, creating a style all his own that emphasized his otherworldly nature. He developed new ceremonies that combined elements from every culture he encountered, always with himself at the center as the divine nexus. His troops adapted as soldiers do. They learned when to kneel, when to avert their eyes, when to press their foreheads to the ground in total submission. Those who couldn't or wouldn't adapt simply disappeared. But it was his treatment of prisoners that really showed how much he had changed. A group of Persian nobles was brought before him, captured after a brief skirmish. In the past, Alexander had treated such men with respect, often releasing them if they swore loyalty. Now he studied them with the detached interest of a god examining, particularly curious insects. "You still pray to your old gods," he said conversationally, "still pour libations to powers that cannot save you." The eldest of the nobles, a proud man with a beard streaked with grey, met his gaze steadily. "We pray to true gods, not men playing at divinity." Alexander's smile was gentle, almost kind. "Playing?" He rose from his throne with fluid grace. "Let me show you what divinity truly means." What followed haunted witnesses for the rest of their lives. Alexander didn't just execute the man, he unmade him, piece by piece, all while explaining the theology of power in a voice that never lost its conversational tone. When it was done, the other nobles fought each other for the privilege of kissing his feet. "You see," he said to his horrified generals afterward, "true divinity requires demonstration. The old gods are distant, abstract. I am here, immediate, real, and very, very capable of miracle and horror in equal measure." The army continued its march east, but now there was a religious fervor to their advance. Each victory was not just a military success but a divine manifestation. Each conquered city, not just a political acquisition, but a conversion to the new faith. Alexander himself became increasingly remote from normal human concerns. He spent hours staring at things only he could see, engaged in conversations only he could hear. His tactical genius, always extraordinary, took on an almost supernatural quality. "He knows things he couldn't possibly know," Ptolemy confided to Hephaestion. "Enemy positions, hidden weaknesses, the exact moment to strike. It's not natural." "Nothing about him is natural anymore," Hephaestion replied quietly. The oracle changed something fundamental, or maybe just revealed what was always there, waiting to emerge. The truth was, Alexander's divine transformation was reshaping the world in ways that went beyond military conquest. His fusion of Greek, Persian and Egyptian elements was creating something entirely new, a universal culture with himself as its living god. Cities began adopting his new style of dress, his new forms of worship, his new way of looking at the world. The change rippled out ahead of his advance, like waves before a storm, transforming ancient societies before his army even reached them. But there was a price for such rapid change, such divine certainty. The human bonds that had once grounded Alexander were snapping one by one. Old friends found themselves unable to meet his gaze. Trusted advisors chose their words with increasing care, never knowing what might trigger divine displeasure. Even Hephaestion found himself increasingly shut out of his friend's confidence. The breaking point came at a feast celebrating the completion of Alexander's new temple in Memphis. The wine flowed freely, and one of his oldest commanders made the mistake of reminiscing about their shared childhood. "I remember when you were just a boy, my king," the man said, wine loosening his tongue. "Always following Philip around, begging to hear stories of battle." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Alexander's eyes fixed on the speaker with terrible intensity. "A boy?" His voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the vast hall. "You think you remember a boy?" He rose from his couch, wine cup still in hand. "Let me show you what that boy became." What followed was both miracle and horror. Some said Alexander's form seemed to shift and change, becoming something larger than human, crowned with divine fire. Others claimed the wine itself turned to blood in their cups. The offending commander fell to his knees, blood pouring from his eyes and ears. "I am no boy," Alexander declared to the terrified assembly. "I am no mere king. I am the living bridge between divine and mortal, and those who forget this," he gestured to the writhing commander, "those who cling to old memories, old limitations, they have no place in the world I am creating." The commander's screams stopped abruptly. His body crumbled to ash that scattered across the marble floor. After that, no one spoke of Alexander's past. No one dared remind him of his mortal origins. He had become something new, something that had never existed before, a god who walked among men, reshaping reality with every step. The oracles. Prophecy had been fulfilled. Alexander had chosen godhood, and there was no turning back. The price was his humanity, but as he often said in those days, divinity required sacrifice. The world trembled before him, and his march east continued. But now it was more than conquest. It was apotheosis written in blood across the face of history. Darius III's war chariot crashed through his own lines, the golden wheels crushing Persian soldiers beneath them, as the King of Kings fled from the golden-haired demon who had turned the tide of battle through sheer, terrifying force of will. The great king abandoned his mother, his wife, his children, everything, to escape the figure who pursued him like divine retribution made flesh. Alexander's laugh echoed across the blood-soaked field of Issus, a sound that made hardened warriors shudder. His white stallion seemed to float above the carnage, its hooves barely touching the earth as it carried its master in pursuit of prey. The afternoon sun caught Alexander's armor, transforming him into a creature of living flame that burned through the Persian ranks like a meteor fallen to earth. "Run!" Alexander's voice carried impossible distances, reaching Darius even as the Persian king's chariot disappeared into the gathering dusk. "Run from your god, little king, but know that divinity moves faster than fear." The battlefield had become an apocalyptic tableau. 200,000 Persians broke formation, fleeing from what they would later describe as a force of nature, wearing human shape. The narrow coastal plain between mountain and sea had become their tomb as Alexander's innovative tactics turned their superior numbers against them. Now that same cramped space became a death trap as panic turned their retreat into a massacre. Alexander reined in his horse atop a small rise, watching Darius vanish into the gathering darkness. His eyes burned with an inner fire that made even his closest companions keep their distance. The oracle's power still sang in his blood, transforming battle fury into something older, something that whispered of ancient gods and primal forces. "My king," Ptolemy's voice shook slightly as he approached. The Persian royal family, and Darius left them behind. A smile curved Alexander's lips, terrible and beautiful as a solar eclipse. Of course he did. A mortal king thinks only of saving himself. He turned his horse toward the Persian camp, where the royal tent still stood like a golden palace amid the chaos. "Let us show him how a god treats fallen enemies." The great king's tent was a city unto itself, filled with luxuries that made even Alexander's veteran commanders gasp in wonder. Gold and silver vessels littered the ground where panicked servants had dropped them. Perfumes worth kingdoms spilled across Persian carpets that could have bought fleets. And in the heart of this abandoned splendor, huddled together like cornered deer, waited the women of Darius's family. Alexander dismounted with fluid grace, his armor still dripping Persian blood. Sisygambis, Darius's mother, raised her chin with royal dignity despite her terror. Beside her, Darius's wife clutched their children, trying to shield them from what she imagined would be a conqueror's brutal attention. But Alexander did not advance like a conqueror. He moved with the practiced grace of a temple dancer, each step measured and precise. When he reached the royal women, he did something that made his general's jaws drop. He knelt. "Mother," he said to Sisygambis in perfect Persian, his voice gentle as a spring breeze, "your son has fled, but you have gained a better one, a divine one." The old queen stared at him, recognition dawning in her eyes. This was not the barbarian monster Persian propaganda had described. This was something far more dangerous, a god wearing human flesh, offering both salvation and damnation in the same breath. "My lord," she began, but Alexander raised a hand, cutting off her words. "Not lord," he corrected softly. "God." The oracle of Siwa confirmed what Persian seers have whispered. "I am Zeus's son, come to claim my divine inheritance." His smile was radiant as sunrise. "And you, royal mother, shall be the first to witness how a god treats those under his protection." He rose in one fluid motion, turning to his commanders. "Let it be known, anyone who harms the Persian royal family answers to divinity itself. They are under my personal protection, to be treated with all the respect their station deserves." A murmur ran through the assembled officers. This was not the usual treatment of conquered enemies. This was something new, a fusion of Greek mercy and divine proclamation that would reshape how wars were fought. But Hephaestion, watching from the shadows, saw something his fellow officers missed. There was calculation in Alexander's mercy, a cold purpose behind his gentle words. He was not just sparing these women, he was transforming them into living symbols of his divine right to rule Persia. The next days proved him right. Alexander treated Darius's family with elaborate courtesy, but he also used them as props, in carefully staged ceremonies that mixed Persian and Greek traditions. Each public appearance reinforced his message. The gods themselves had chosen him to rule both worlds. Meanwhile, the pursuit of Darius became an obsession that bordered on the supernatural. Alexander drove his army at an inhuman pace, following trails that should have been impossible to track. He barely slept, barely ate, his eyes burning with divine fire as he pushed ever eastward. He is no longer merely hunting a man, Ptolemy confided to Hephaestion during a rare rest. He hunts the idea of Persian kingship itself. Hephaestion watched his friend pace the command tent, talking to voices only he could hear. "No," he replied softly. "He hunts his own destiny. Darius is just the key to unlocking it." The army penetrated deeper into the Persian heartland, and, with each victory, Alexander's divine transformation became more pronounced. He began wearing a mixture of Greek armor and Persian royal garments, creating a unique style that emphasized his role as bridge between worlds. His ceremonies became more elaborate, combining elements from every culture he encountered. But it was in private moments that the full impact of his change became clear. One night, unable to sleep, he summoned Hephaestion to his tent. "Do you know what I see when I close my eyes?" he asked, his voice distant and dreamy. "I see the threads that bind reality together. I see how gods reshape the world through pure will." He turned to his oldest friend, his eyes reflecting lamplight like burning gold. "When I catch Darius, when I take his throne, the transformation will be complete. I will be the first true god-king this world has ever known." "Alexander," Hephaestion started, but stopped at the look in his friend's eyes. "That name belongs to the past," Alexander said softly. "To a mortal prince who died at Siwa. I am becoming something else, something necessary for the new world I will create." Outside the tent, the army slept fitfully, dreaming of the divine force that drove them ever eastward. Inside, a god who had once been human planned the reshaping of reality itself. The hunt continued, pushing deeper into lands no Greek army had ever seen. Alexander's tactical innovations shocked both friends and foes. No one had ever seen warfare conducted with such brilliant, terrible efficiency. But it was more than just military genius. There was something in his presence now that made hardened warriors tremble, something that whispered of powers older than civilization itself. Word came that Darius was gathering a new army, larger than the force destroyed at Issus. Alexander's reaction was not what his generals expected. Instead of concern, he showed only a terrible joy. "Good," he said, his smile radiant and frightening. "Let him gather every soldier in Asia. Let him build an army that darkens the horizon. It will make the victory sweeter, the transformation more complete." He began making preparations for the confrontation, but not in any way his officers recognized. Traditional military planning mixed with mysterious rituals learned at Siwa. Maps shared space with sacred texts. Battle plans incorporated astronomical alignments. "The next battle will be more than mere combat," he explained to his increasingly uneasy generals. "It will be apotheosis, the moment when divine will reshapes the very foundations of power." His army watched these preparations with a mixture of awe and fear. They had long since stopped seeing him as merely human, but this was something new. Their young king was planning not just to defeat Darius, but to supplant him in some fundamental, cosmic sense. The march continued, and with each passing day, Alexander's divine nature became more pronounced. His orders took on the weight of prophecy. His anger, when roused, had effects that defied natural law. Even his appearance seemed to shift subtly, becoming something more than human. One evening, a scout brought news that made Alexander's eyes blaze with inner fire. Darius had been seen heading toward a place called Gaugamela, a name that meant camel's house in the local tongue. "Perfect," Alexander breathed, and there was something in his voice that made even the bravest step back. The house of the beast of burden. How appropriate for a mortal king fleeing divine justice. He spent that night in communion with powers. Only he could perceive. his tent blazing with strange lights that made his guards pray to whatever gods they still believed in. When he emerged at dawn, his transformation was complete. Gone was any trace of the young Macedonian prince. In his place stood something ancient and terrible, a force of nature wrapped in human flesh. His golden hair seemed to move in winds. No one else could feel. His eyes held fires that burned hotter than earthly flame. "The time has come," he announced to his assembled officers. "Darius thinks he faces a conqueror, a mere mortal king seeking earthly power. He will learn what it means to stand against divinity itself." The army began its final advance, guided by their god-king toward a confrontation that would reshape the known world. Alexander rode at their head, his presence both magnificent and terrifying, a living embodiment of divine will made manifest in flesh. Behind him his men whispered prayers, not to the gods they had grown up with, but to the God who walked among them, who led them toward destiny with the certainty of fate itself. The mad conqueror had fully embraced his divine nature, and the world trembled before him. Ahead lay Gaugamela, and with it the final transformation of a man into something that had never existed before, a god who walked in human flesh, reshaping reality with every step. Darius waited with his vast army, still thinking in terms of mortal combat. He could not know that he faced not just a brilliant general, not just a conqueror, but a force of nature that would sweep away the old order like autumn leaves before a divine wind. The stage was set for a battle that would be remembered not just as a military engagement, but as the moment when the boundary between human and divine was forever erased. The mad conqueror rode toward his destiny, and the very foundations of reality shuddered in anticipation. Dawn painted the plains of Gaugamela blood-red, as Alexander watched 500,000 Persian soldiers deploy before him, their weapons glinting like stars fallen to earth. The air hummed with the sound of countless bowstrings being tested, spear points being sharpened, and the prayers of men who knew they might not see another sunset. Scented smoke from Persian censers drifted across the battlefield, mixing with the earthier smells of horses, sweat, and fear. "My king!" Parmenion's voice shook slightly as he approached. "Their numbers, they stretch beyond sight. We are but 40,000. Alexander turned to his oldest general, and something in his eyes made the veteran warrior step back. The divine fire that had been growing since Siwa now blazed like a captured sun, transforming his face into something ancient and terrible. "Numbers!" His laugh carried unnaturally across the pre-dawn air, making horses stamp nervously and men clutch their weapons tighter. "Numbers matter to mortals, old friend. We are beyond such concerns now." He wheeled Bucephalus toward the assembled Macedonian army, his armor catching the rising sun and transforming him into a creature of living flame. When he spoke, his voice reached every ear, though he didn't seem to raise it above a whisper. "Look upon them." He gestured at the Persian host. "Look at their golden chariots, their jeweled armor, their silk banners. They come as men to face. Our God!" His smile was terrible and beautiful. "Let us show them the price of such presumption." A murmur ran through the Macedonian ranks. They had grown used to their king's divine claims, had seen enough impossibilities to half believe them. But there was something different about him today, something that made even the bravest feel a primitive urge to kneel or flee. Alexander turned back to study the Persian lines, his eyes seeing patterns that existed somewhere between tactical reality and divine revelation. Darius had learned from Issus, had chosen his ground perfectly. The plain was wide enough for his superior numbers to matter, and he'd had slaves clear it of obstacles that might hinder his scythed chariots. "Perfect," Alexander breathed, and there was something in his voice that made nearby officers exchange worried glances. "He thinks he's prepared for a battle. He's prepared for slaughter." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full scope of what they faced. Persian cavalry on both wings, far outflanking the Macedonian line. Elite immortals in the center, their black armor drinking the light. And behind them all, High King Darius in his towering war chariot, surrounded by the flower of Persian nobility. Normal commanders would have faltered at such a sight. Even Alexander's veteran generals felt their hearts sink. But their king sat his horse with the calm certainty of a god viewing insects, his smile growing wider as he noted each Persian advantage. "They've arranged themselves for their own destruction," he said to Hephaestion, who alone dared ride close to him in these moments, like pieces on a game board placing themselves exactly where divine will requires. "Alexander," Hephaestion started, but stopped at the look in his friend's eyes. "That name belongs to the past," Alexander said softly. "To a mortal prince who died at Siwa, watch now what a god can do with an army." He raised his hand, and 40,000 men held their breath. The morning sun caught his upraised arm, surrounding him with a halo of light that his soldiers would later swear was divine fire. Even the Persians seemed to pause, sensing something momentous about to unfold. When Alexander dropped his hand, reality itself seemed to bend. The Macedonian army moved like a single organism, executing the most complex battlefield maneuver any of them had ever attempted. It was something Alexander had shown them in the days before, an innovation in warfare that seemed to defy geometric logic. The entire army shifted at an angle while maintaining formation, creating patterns that seemed to ripple across the plain like waves on water. The Persians, seeing what looked like disorder in the enemy ranks, took the bait. Their left-wing cavalry charged, exactly as Alexander had foreseen, exactly as divinity had whispered would happen. "Watch," he said softly, his eyes blazing with inner fire. "Watch how gods make war." The Persian cavalry crashed against Alexander's shifted lines, like waves breaking on hidden rocks. What had seemed like disorder revealed itself as deadly purpose. Gaps opened and closed with mechanical precision, trapping the Persian horsemen in killing zones they hadn't even known existed. "Now," Alexander breathed, his voice carrying impossible distances across the battlefield, "show them what happens when mortals challenge gods." The Macedonian cavalry struck like thunderbolts, their wedge formations splitting Persian units into manageable chunks that were systematically destroyed. The sound was apocalyptic, screaming horses, shattering spears, the prayers and curses of dying men carried away on winds that seemed to obey Alexander's will. Darius watched from his war chariot as his left wing dissolved into chaos. The great king had faced Greeks before, had studied their tactics, had prepared countermeasures for everything he'd seen at Issus. But this was something new, something that shouldn't have been possible. Alexander sat Bucephalus like a statue, directing the battle with small gestures that somehow reached commanders across the vast battlefield. His eyes blazed with inner fire as he watched his divine vision unfold exactly as he'd seen it in his dreams. Every movement, every death, every shift in the battle's flow followed patterns he'd discovered in that space between tactical genius and divine revelation. "The gap opens," he said softly, though his generals heard him clearly despite the battle's din. "Watch now. Watch what happens when reality bends to divine will." The Persian center, seeing their left wing crumbling, began to shift. Again, exactly as Alexander had foreseen. The movement created a small gap in their lines, tiny, barely noticeable to mortal eyes. But to a god of war, it was an invitation written in fate itself. "With me," Alexander's voice carried over the chaos like a trumpet blast. His companion cavalry, the finest horsemen in the world, formed up around him with practiced precision. "Show them how gods make war." They struck the Persian center like a spear thrust by Zeus himself. Alexander led the charge personally, his sword moving with impossible speed, each stroke claiming lives with surgical precision. Those who witnessed it would later swear his blade left trails of fire in the air, that Persian arrows seemed to curve around him as if nature itself refused to harm divinity. "Look!" the cry went up from the Persian ranks. His eyes burn like stars." The elite immortals, Iran's finest warriors, faced him with desperate courage. Their curved swords sparked against his armor, their arrows darkened the sky above his head. But Alexander rode through their defenses like a god descending to earth, untouchable, unstoppable, terrible in his divine glory. "I see you, Darius," his voice carried across the battlefield, reaching the Persian king's ears with unnatural clarity. "Run again, little king. Run from divine judgment." Darius stood in his chariot, watching as this golden-haired demon carved a path straight toward him. He had come to Gaugamela prepared for a battle against a brilliant young general. Instead, he faced something out of ancient prophecy, a force of nature wearing human flesh. The great king's nerve broke, just as Alexander had foreseen, just as divinity had whispered in his dreams. Darius turned his chariot and fled. Again, the Persian army, seeing their king retreat, began to collapse. But Alexander didn't immediately pursue. Instead, he reined in Bucephalus and raised his bloody sword to the sky. His voice carried to every corner of the vast battlefield. "Behold how mortals flee before divine wrath. Behold the power of a key, God made flesh." His men, even those who had known him since childhood, fell to their knees in the bloody dust. The sight of him in that moment would haunt their dreams forever. Golden armor painted red with Persian blood, eyes blazing with inner fire. His very presence something that seemed to distort reality around him. But it was what happened next that truly marked the difference between the Alexander who had left Macedonia and the god-king he had become. "Kill them all," he commanded, his voice soft, but carrying to every ear. Every Persian, every mercenary, every man who dared stand against divinity. No prisoners, no mercy. Let the vultures feast on those who challenged a god. Parmenion, who had served Alexander's father and had watched the young prince grow up, dared to object. "My king, they're beaten. They sue for quarter. This isn't our way, our way." Alexander turned to the old general, and something in his eyes made the veteran warrior step back. "I am beyond ways, beyond customs, beyond mortal constraints. I am divine will made manifest, and I decree that this day shall be written in blood." The massacre that followed would be whispered about in taverns and nightmares for generations. Alexander's army, caught up in their king's divine madness, swept across the battlefield like demons unleashed. Men who tried to surrender were cut down. Persians who begged for mercy found none. Alexander rode through the slaughter like death's own master of ceremonies, his sword never still, his laughter carrying over the screams of the dying. Those who met his eyes in those hours saw something that defied human understanding. A god of war drunk on blood and victory, reveling in power that transcended mortal limits. Only Hephaestion, watching from the edge of the carnage, saw the price of such transcendence. In rare moments between kills, when Alexander thought no one was watching, a flicker of something crossed his face. Pain, fear, the last traces of humanity crying out as divinity burned it away. But such moments passed quickly, submerged beneath the tide of divine power that had possessed him since Siwa. By the time the sun set on Gaugamela's blood-soaked plain, Alexander's transformation was complete. He summoned his commanders to what had been Darius's command post, now surrounded by pyramids of Persian heads. The great king's abandoned treasures lay scattered about, gold cups, jeweled weapons, silks worth kingdoms. Alexander ignored them all, his focus on something beyond mortal wealth. "Today," he announced to his assembled officers, "marks the end of the old world and the beginning of my divine reign. No longer will there be Greeks and Persians, east and west, conquered and conqueror. There will be only those who accept my divinity and those who die denying it." He gestured to a group of captured Persian nobles, men who had been commanders mere hours ago. "Kneel before divinity," he commanded them. The Persians, trained from birth to view their kings as divine, hesitated only briefly before prostrating themselves. But when Alexander turned to his Macedonian officers, expecting the same obeisance, the atmosphere grew tense. "My king," Clytus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River, stepped forward. "We are Macedonians. We don't bow to any man, even kings." "Man!" Alexander's laugh made the air itself seem to shiver. "Look upon me, old friend. Look with eyes unclouded by memory. Do I seem like a man to you?" In truth, he didn't. The divine fire that had possessed him during battle still burned in his eyes. His skin seemed to glow from within, and the air around him shimmered like heat waves off sun-baked stone. Even his voice had changed, carrying harmonics that made mortal minds want to shut down in self-defense. One by one, the Macedonian officers knelt. Even Clytus, after a long moment of hesitation, bent his knee. Only Hephaestion remained standing, and even he couldn't meet Alexander's gaze. "So be it," Alexander said softly. "The old world dies today. Tomorrow we begin building something new, something divine." He turned to his maps, already planning the next phase of his conquest. But those who looked closely saw his hands trembling slightly, not with fear or exhaustion, but with the effort of containing power that threatened to burn away what remained of his human shell. The army made camp among the dead, but few slept that night. The sounds of victory celebrations mixed with quieter, more worried conversations. Soldiers who had followed Alexander since he was a youth traded stories of the changes they'd seen, how he'd grown more distant, more powerful, more terrifying with each victory. "Did you see him during the battle?" one veteran whispered to another. "The way Persian arrows curved around him, the way his sword moved faster than human eyes could follow." "I saw something worse," his companion replied. "I saw his face when he ordered the massacre. There was nothing human left in those eyes." Such whispers multiplied in the darkness, spreading through the camp like fever. But none dared voice their fears too loudly. They had all seen what happened to those who questioned divinity. In his tent, Alexander paced like a caged storm, his energy barely contained. Maps and battle plans lay scattered about, already marked with his plans for the next campaign. But his mind was elsewhere, wrestling with the transformation that threatened to consume what remained of his humanity. "The power grows stronger," he told Hephaestion, who alone dared be near him in these moments. "With each victory, each death, each moment of divine revelation, I feel myself becoming more." "More what?" Hephaestion asked softly. "More everything. More than human, more than king, more than even I imagined possible." Alexander's laugh held an edge of something that might have been fear. "The oracle warned me that gods cannot unmake themselves. I didn't understand then. I do now." He stopped pacing suddenly, turning to face his oldest friend with eyes that burned like captured stars. "Do you know what I saw during the battle? Not just troop movements and tactical advantages. I saw the threads that bind reality together. I saw how gods reshape the world through pure will." Hephaestion watched as Alexander resumed his restless movement, his bare feet leaving brief after-images on the Persian carpets. The man he had grown up with, the friend he had loved like a brother, was disappearing piece by piece. Something else was taking his place, something magnificent and terrible, something that made even the most hardened warriors tremble. Dawn found Alexander still awake, standing at the edge of the battlefield watching carrion birds feast on the dead. His expression was one of scientific curiosity, as if studying how divine will manifested in the mundane world. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said to Ptolemy, who had approached with reports. "How quickly the world adapts to changes in the divine order." Ptolemy looked at the field of death, the pyramids of severed heads, the rivers of dried blood. Beautiful was not the word he would have chosen. But Alexander was already moving, on his mind racing ahead to new conquests, new transformations, new manifestations of divine will. The victory at Gaugamela had proven his divinity to the world. Now it was time to reshape that world in his divine image. The mad conquerors. Ascension was complete. The price had been rivers of blood and the last traces of his humanity. But as he often said in those days, divinity required sacrifice. The world would never be the same. A god walked among men, and his footsteps left fire in their wake. The conquest of Asia was just the beginning. There were still worlds to reshape, realities to bend, and the divine fire that burned within him would accept nothing less than total transformation. Stone screamed as it shattered, the ancient walls of Tyre weeping dust and mortar, under the relentless assault of Alexander's siege engines. 7 months of futile attacks had transformed the once pristine shoreline into a graveyard of broken ships and bloated corpses, the Mediterranean's crystal waters stained crimson by the endless stream of dead. The impossible causeway, 800 feet of engineering defiance stretching from mainland to island, stood as testament to Alexander's growing madness, each stone mortared with the bones and blood of those who had died building it. Alexander stood at the causeway's end, his golden armor dulled by salt spray and stone dust, watching his latest rams batter the walls that had resisted him for so long. 7 months of failure had carved new lines in his face, had put a wild light in, his eyes that made even his closest companions keep their distance. This was no longer mere military necessity. This had become an obsession, a divine vendetta against a city that dared defy a god. "My king," Parmenion approached carefully, noting how Alexander's hand tightened on his sword hilt at the interruption. "The men need rest. The rams have been working for 20 hours straight." "Rest?" Alexander's laugh held an edge that made nearby soldiers flinch. Did the builders of this causeway rest? Did the waves rest as they tried to sweep away our work? Did the Tyrian arrows rest as they rained death upon us? He turned to face his old general, and there was something in his eyes that made even the veteran commander step back. "I am beyond rest, beyond mortal limitations. And when these walls finally break—" His smile was terrible in the dying light. "When they break, there will be rest enough in death." The causeway itself was a monument to divine determination, overruling mortal possibility. When the sea had swallowed their first attempts, Alexander had ordered entire forests stripped bare, whole mountains torn down for stone. When storms had wrecked their work, he had commanded the waves themselves to submit, having his priests perform rituals that mixed Greek ceremony with darker, older magics learned at Siwa. Some said he spoke to the stones themselves during the long nights, whispering promises and threats in languages no living man should know. Others swore they had seen him standing in the surf during storms, laughing as lightning split the sky, daring the gods of sea and storm to defy his will. The siege engines were his latest innovation, monstrous towers that loomed over the battlements like the hands of giants. Each morning brought new horrors for the defenders: scorpions that launched spears the size of trees, ballistae that could pierce 6 men with a single bolt, catapults that flung burning pitch and shattered stone against the ancient walls. But Tyre's defenses had been built to last eternities. Her walls, 40 feet thick in places, had weathered assault since before written history. Her people were Phoenicians, masters of the sea, proud descendants of traders and explorers who had mapped the edges of the known world. They had never been conquered, never bent the knee to foreign kings. They had thought themselves safe on their island fortress, watching Alexander's initial fury spend itself against the half-mile of deep water that separated them from the mainland. When he had begun building his causeway, they had laughed. When storms had destroyed his first attempts, they had celebrated. They weren't laughing now. A tremendous crack echoed across the water as another ram struck home. This time something different happened. The wall shuddered, and a section of ancient stone shifted visibly. "There!" Alexander's voice carried impossible distances, cutting through the chaos of battle like a blade through flesh. "The gods themselves mark our victory. Break them now!" The rams redoubled their efforts, their crews driven beyond exhaustion by their king's divine fury. The crack in the wall spread like lightning through stone, a web of destruction that promised imminent collapse. Tyrian defenders crowded the battlements, desperately trying to drop stones and burning oil on the rams below. But Alexander had planned for this too. His archers unleashed a storm of arrows that turned the sky black, forcing the defenders to choose between taking cover or attempting to stop the rams. Another crack, louder than the first. A section of wall began to lean inward. "My king," Hephaestion spoke quietly from Alexander's side, "if we breach the walls now in the darkness, the men will be hard to control. Perhaps if we waited for dawn—" "Control?" Alexander turned to his oldest friend, and there was something in his smile that made even Hephaestion's blood run cold. "I don't want control. I want devastation. I want this city's destruction to echo through eternity. I want future generations to walk through these ruins and weep, knowing what happens when mortals deny divinity." As if in response to his words, the wall finally gave way. Centuries of proud defiance collapsed in a thunderous roar, ancient stone surrendering at last to divine will. The breach gaped like a wound in Tyre's ancient face, and through it poured Alexander's army, transformed by 7 months of frustration into something more akin to demons than men. "Kill them all," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying that strange harmonic that made even the bravest shudder. "Kill them all and feed their souls to the sea gods who dared defy us. Let the Mediterranean run red with the price of defiance." What followed would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. Alexander's army, driven beyond human limits by their king's divine madness, fell upon Tyre like wolves upon a wounded deer. Men who tried to surrender were cut down. Women who begged for mercy found none. Children, even hardened veterans, would weep later, remembering what happened to the children. Alexander himself led the massacre, his sword never still, his laughter carrying over the screams of the dying. Those who met his eyes in those hours saw something that defied human understanding. A god of war drunk on blood and vengeance, reveling in power that transcended mortal limits. "See how mortality burns?" he shouted as he set fire to Tyre's ancient temples. "See how stone and flesh submit to divine will?" The fires spread, turning night to apocalyptic day. Tyre, which had stood proud for millennia, became an inferno that could be seen from 50 miles away. The heat was so intense that the sea itself seemed to boil where it met the blood-stained shores. But it was what happened after the initial slaughter that truly marked how far Alexander had fallen from humanity. 8,000 surviving Tyrians were crucified along the shoreline, their crosses stretching for miles along the coast. Alexander ordered them arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to hold some significance only he could see. As he walked among the dying, he spoke to them in languages that made the air itself seem to shiver. "A new form of sacrifice," he explained to his horrified generals. "The old gods demanded blood on their altars, but I—" His smile was radiant and terrible. "I make altars of entire cities." The army watched in uneasy silence as their king performed strange rituals among the crosses, his voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed to distort reality itself. Even those who had known him since childhood could no longer recognize the man they had followed from Macedonia. Hephaestion found him at dawn, standing amid the crucified as if conducting some vast, terrible orchestra of death. The rising sun painted everything crimson, making it impossible to tell where blood ended and light began. "Alexander," he started, but his friend cut him off with a gesture. "That name belongs to the past," he said softly, his eyes fixed on something beyond mortal sight. "To a prince who thought sieges were about military necessity. This—" he gestured at the devastation around them. "This is about transformation, about showing the world what happens when divine will manifests in flesh." He turned to face his oldest friend, and there was something in his eyes that made even Hephaestion want to flee. "Do you hear them? The old gods? They whisper such secrets, such possibilities." "I hear nothing," Hephaestion said carefully, "except the cries of the dying." "Exactly." Alexander's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Death is the ultimate transformer. Through death mortals touch divinity. Through death the veil between worlds grows thin." He reached out and touched one of the crucified men, his fingers leaving trails of light on the dying flesh. "Can't. You see, every death is a key unlocking another fragment of divine power." The army remained at Tyre for 7 days and 7 nights, matching the length of time it had taken the gods to create the world in ancient myths. Each day brought new horrors as Alexander explored the limits of his divine power, using the dying city as a laboratory for experiments that blended military innovation with religious ecstasy. He ordered the surviving priests of Melkart, Tyre's patron deity, brought before him in the ruins of their temple. The old men came proudly, expecting death, but determined to maintain their dignity. "Your god," Alexander addressed them, seated on a throne made from the shattered remains of sacred statues, was called the Lord of the City, the King of the underworld, the one who dies and rises. His smile was gentle, almost kind. "Let's test that last part, shall we?" What followed made even his most hardened veterans vomit. The priests died slowly, their ends choreographed by Alexander, to match ancient rituals of resurrection, but there would be no rising for them. Their bodies were burned and their ashes scattered on the wind, their souls denied even the peace of proper burial. See? Alexander stood amid the ashes, his arms spread wide as if embracing some invisible power. See how easily old gods die when true divinity walks the earth? The army's mood grew increasingly uneasy. Soldiers who had followed Alexander since he was a youth traded worried whispers about the changes they'd seen, how their brilliant young king had transformed into something that seemed to transcend human limitations, but perhaps not in a way that was entirely divine. The first assassination attempt came on the 5th night. A group of veterans, driven to desperate action by what they'd witnessed, tried to poison his wine. Alexander smiled as he watched the would-be assassins writhe and die, having somehow switched the cups without anyone seeing. Poison? His laugh echoed through the ruined city. I am beyond such mortal concerns now. The oracle showed me truths you cannot imagine, unlocked powers you cannot comprehend. He ordered the bodies of the assassins added to his geometric patterns, so of crucifixion, their deaths feeding whatever dark purpose drove his endless rituals among the dying. On the 7th day, as the sun set fire to the western horizon, Alexander gathered his army to witness his final act of transformation. He stood amid the ruins of Tyre's greatest temple, his armor catching the light in ways that made him seem to glow from within. "Behold," his voice carried to every ear, though he spoke barely above a whisper, "behold how gods remake the world." He ordered the last surviving members of Tyre's royal family brought before him, proud Phoenician nobles who had ruled this city since before the Trojan War. Their deaths were choreographed with theatrical precision, each one positioned to match star patterns only Alexander could see. As the last noble died, something seemed to shift in the air itself. Those present would later swear they felt reality bend, as if some fundamental force had been reshaped by will and blood. Alexander stood amid the carnage, his eyes blazing. Within a fire, his laugh carrying harmonics that made men's bones vibrate and their minds cloud with religious terror. "It is done," he announced to the assembled army. "The old powers are broken. The old gods flee before my advance. From this day forward, there is only one divinity in this world, and you have witnessed its birth in blood and stone." The army began its march eastward the next day, leaving Tyre's ruins to the carrion birds and the restless dead. But something had changed, not just in their king, but in how they saw him. The brilliant young commander they had followed from Macedonia was gone, replaced by something that straddled the line between divine power and madness. As they marched, soldiers whispered stories of what they'd seen in Tyre, how their king had spoken to the dead in languages that made reality itself shiver, how he had performed rituals that seemed to bend the laws of nature, how his fury had reduced one of the ancient world's greatest cities to ash and memory. But it was Hephaestion, riding close to his friend as always, who saw the true cost of such power. In rare moments between divine proclamations and bloody rituals, when Alexander thought no one was watching, something flickered across his face. Pain, fear, the last traces of humanity crying out as divinity burned it away. Such moments passed, quickly, submerged beneath the tide of power that had possessed him since Siwa. The mad conqueror pressed on, his eyes fixed on horizons only he could see, his mind filled with visions of transformations yet to come. The world would never be the same. A god walked among men and his footsteps left fire in their wake. The destruction of Tyre was just the beginning. There were still cities to burn, realities to bend, and the divine fire that burned within him would accept nothing less than total transformation. 3 deaths unfolded in perfect synchronization across the vastness of Asia. In Media, the aged General Parmenion knelt before his executioners, snow crunching beneath his weathered knees. 1,000 miles away, his son Philotas screamed on the torture rack in Alexander's camp, his confession echoing off canvas walls. And in his private tent, Alexander himself performed strange rituals learned at Siwa, burning letters that might, or might not, have contained evidence of their treason, while whispering in languages that made reality shiver. The winter wind howled across the Persian highlands, catching the last words of a man who had served 3 generations of Macedonian kings. "Tell my daughter I died well," Parmenion said to the officer who had once served under his command. The sword fell, sending crimson spraying across pristine snow. In that same moment, Philotas's latest scream cut off abruptly as another bone shattered. The torture master looked to Alexander for instruction, but the king's eyes were fixed on something only he could see, his fingers tracing patterns in the air that seemed to distort the light around them. "Again," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying those strange harmonics that had become more pronounced since Tyre. "The truth hides in pain. Break him until it emerges." The torture resumed, but Alexander's attention was already elsewhere. He knelt before a bronze brazier filled with sacred fire, feeding it carefully selected papers, correspondence between father and son that spanned decades of military service. "Watch," he instructed Hephaestion, who alone dared be present for these moments. "Watch how divine sight reveals truth in flame." The smoke twisted in ways smoke shouldn't, forming shapes that made Hephaestion's eyes water and his mind recoil. Alexander read messages in those impossible patterns, his smile growing wider with each revelation. "See?" He gestured at particularly disturbing whirl of smoke. "See how the threads of treachery weave through everything? Their plots within plots, their careful words hiding daggers." Hephaestion saw only smoke, but he had learned not to contradict his king in these moments. Since Tyre, Alexander's paranoia had grown alongside his power, each feeding the other in a terrible spiral that threatened to consume everything in its path. "My king," an officer entered, carefully averting his eyes from whatever ritual Alexander was performing. "Word from media, it's done." Alexander didn't turn from his brazier. "Show me his head when it arrives. I want to read the truth in his dead eyes." His voice held no emotion, as if discussing the weather rather than the execution of his father's most trusted general. Philotas's screams had stopped again. The torture master waited, knowing from experience that his king would want to continue, to extract every possible confession from flesh that was quickly running out of secrets to yield. But Alexander's attention had shifted again. He rose from the brazier with fluid grace, the smoke seeming to cling to him like a living cloak. "Bring me the other suspects, all of them. The night is young, and truth has so many layers to peel away." What followed would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. Alexander moved through the interrogations like a dancer, his questions probing deeper than mere physical torture could reach. He seemed to know exactly what each suspect feared most, exactly which memories to twist, exactly how to break minds that had already surrendered their bodies. "You see how they lie?" he asked Hephaestion as dawn approached. "How they weave deceptions even as they confess. The plots run deeper than even I suspected." The army watched in growing horror as their king's paranoia claimed more victims. Men who had served Alexander since he was a youth found themselves questioned about conversations from years ago. Officers who had bled for Macedonia were executed for glances that might have held treasonous intent. But it was in the quiet moments between interrogations that the true extent of Alexander's transformation became clear. "The oracle showed me," he explained to Hephaestion as they walked among the execution posts. "Showed me how reality bends around human intention. Every thought leaves traces in the air, visible to divine sight. Every plot, every scheme, every hidden desire." He stopped suddenly, his head tilting like a predator catching a scent. "There. Do you see it?" He pointed at empty air. "The threads of conspiracy weaving through everything, beautiful in its way like spider silk in morning dew." Hephaestion saw nothing but the pre-dawn mist, but he nodded carefully. "What do the threads tell you?" Alexander's smile was terrible in the grey light. "That we've only begun to uncover the truth. That every person who has ever known me, ever served me, might be part of it. Even you, old friend." He reached out and touched Hephaestion's cheek with fingers that burned like brands. "Even you might be woven into their web without knowing it." The purge expanded like ripples in a poisoned pond. Anyone connected to Parmenion or Philotas, however tangentially, found themselves under suspicion. Ancient friendships meant nothing. Battlefield brotherhood counted for less than nothing. The only currency that mattered was absolute, unquestioning submission to Alexander's divine will. The army's character changed as veteran Macedonian officers were replaced by Persian nobles who had never known Alexander as anything but a god in human flesh. The old guard, who had followed him from Macedonia, found themselves increasingly marginalized. Those who objected simply disappeared. Clytus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River, watched these changes with growing concern. "He's lost himself," he confided to what remained of the old guard. "The boy we followed from Macedonia is gone, replaced by something else." But such words, even whispered in private, had a way of reaching divine ears. Alexander's spies were everywhere, and they reported not just words but gestures, expressions, even dreams that might hide seditious intent. The king himself seemed to exist increasingly in a realm beyond normal human concerns. He spent hours performing strange rituals learned at Siwa, communing with powers that left scorch marks on reality itself. His orders became more erratic, his divine proclamations more grandiose. "The mortal shell cracks," he told Hephaestion during one of his late-night wanderings. "With each truth revealed, each conspiracy uncovered, I feel myself becoming more." He laughed, and there was something in the sound that made even his oldest friend want to flee. "The oracle warned me that gods cannot unmake themselves. I understand now, I understand everything." The army pressed eastward, but the atmosphere had changed. Men who had once marched proudly now moved like servants in a temple, careful not to make any noise that might draw divine attention. Officers gave orders in whispers, fearful that normal command voices might be interpreted as challenges to divine authority. Alexander watched it all with the detached interest of a god observing human insects. He had begun wearing a mixture of Persian and Greek royal garments, creating a style all his own that emphasized his otherworldly nature. His appearances became increasingly theatrical, each entrance choreographed to reinforce his divine status. But it was in his private moments that the full extent of his transformation became clear. Servants reported hearing him speak to unseen presences in dozens of languages, some of which seemed to make the air itself grow thin. His personal quarters were filled with strange implements whose purposes none dared guess. The breaking point came at a feast celebrating the army's latest victory. Wine flowed freely, too freely, and Clytus the Black made the mistake of reminiscing about Philip's reign. "There was a king who understood he was human," Clytus said, his voice carrying in a momentary lull, "who didn't need divine pretensions to be great." The temperature in the feast hall seemed to drop. Alexander rose from his couch with unnatural grace, his eyes blazing with inner fire. "Pretensions." His voice was soft, but it carried harmonics that made men's bones vibrate. "You think divinity pretends, old friend? Let me show you the difference between pretense and power." What followed would be whispered about in terrified tones for generations. Some said Alexander's form seemed to shift and change, becoming something larger than human, crowned with divine fire. Others claimed the wine itself turned to blood in their cups. Clytus fell to his knees, blood pouring from his eyes and ears. "I am beyond human judgment," Alexander declared to the terrified assembly, "beyond mortal constraints, and those who cling to old memories, old limitations." He gestured to the writhing form of his once friend. "They have no place in the world I am creating." Clytus's screams stopped abruptly. His body crumbled to ash that scattered across the marble floor. After that, no one dared remind Alexander of his mortal origins. The last connections to his human past were systematically severed, replaced by an increasingly elaborate divine cult that borrowed elements from every religion they encountered. But in rare moments when he thought no one was watching, something flickered across Alexander's face. Pain, fear, the last traces of humanity crying out as divinity burned it away. Such moments passed quickly, submerged beneath the tide of power that had possessed him since Siwa. The mad conqueror pressed on, his eyes fixed on horizons only he could see, his mind filled with visions of transformations yet to come. The world trembled before him, and his march eastward continued. But now it was more than conquest. It was apotheosis, written in blood across the face of history. A god walked among men, and his footsteps left fire in their wake. The golden wine cup shattered against the marble column, its contents spraying like arterial blood across the Persian tapestries. In the sudden silence that followed, Alexander's laugh carried those terrible harmonics that had become more pronounced since Siwa, a sound that made even hardened warriors want to cover their ears and pray to whatever gods still dared exist in his presence. "Say it again, old friend." His voice was soft as a lover's whisper, but it filled every corner of the vast feast hall. "Tell me again how my father was the greater king." Clytus the Black stood his ground, decades of battlefield courage warring with the survival instinct that screamed at him to flee. The feast hall in Maracanda had become oppressively silent, hundreds of warriors and nobles holding their breath as they watched divine madness dance with mortal defiance. "I spoke only truth." Clytus's voice was hoarse from hours of drinking, but it didn't waver. "Philip built the army you inherited. Philip unified Greece while you were still learning to walk. Philip died." Alexander's roar shook the golden lampstands, making flames dance and shadows leap like living things. "Philip died and a god rose in his place. How dare you compare a mortal king to divine will made flesh?" The air in the feast hall grew thick and strange, charged with the same energy that preceded devastating storms. Alexander's form seemed to shift and blur at the edges, as if reality itself couldn't quite contain whatever he was becoming. The Persian nobles present had already prostrated themselves, pressing their foreheads to the wine-stained floor, but the Macedonian veterans, led by Clytus, remained defiantly upright. "I saved your life at the Granicus," Clytus pressed on, perhaps sensing that he was already dead and choosing to make his end meaningful. "When that Persian axe was falling toward your royal neck, it was my very mortal arm that deflected it. Or have you forgotten that gods can bleed?" Alexander moved with that terrible liquid grace he had possessed since Siwa, crossing the space between them faster than human eyes could follow. His hand caught Clytus's throat, fingers burning like brands against the old warrior's flesh. "Shall we test that theory?" Alexander's smile was radiant and terrible, his eyes blazing with inner fire that had nothing to do with the wine they'd been drinking. "Shall we see what happens when mortality challenges divinity?" Hephaestion stepped forward, trying one last time to prevent the inevitable. "Alexander, that name belongs to the past." Alexander's free hand slashed through the air, leaving traces of light in its wake. "To a prince who needed saving. I am beyond such mortal weakness now. Let me demonstrate." What followed would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. Some would later swear Alexander's form grew larger than human, crowned with divine fire that cast no shadows. Others remembered the way reality seemed to bend around him, how the very air grew thin and strange as he channeled powers no mortal was meant to touch. Clytus didn't scream. Even as Alexander's touch began to unmake him, the old warrior kept his eyes locked on his king's face, searching for any trace of the young prince he had once protected. His last words, barely whispered through a throat that was turning to ash, carried clearly in the unnatural silence. "Philip's son died at Siwa. What rules us now is neither man nor God, but something that should not be." Then he was gone, his body crumbling to grey ash that scattered across the Persian carpets. Alexander stood motionless in the aftermath, his hand still raised, divine fire still crackling around him like a storm given flesh. The feast hall erupted in chaos. Macedonian veterans who had followed Alexander since childhood broke and ran, their courage finally failing in the face of what their king had become. Persian nobles remained prostrate, offering prayers to this terrible new god who had supplanted their ancient deities. But Alexander's attention had already shifted inward, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. The divine fire that had consumed Clytus continued to burn around him, casting strange shadows that moved independent of any light source. "Beautiful," he whispered, watching patterns in the air that no one else could perceive. "See how reality bends, how mortal flesh submits to divine will." Hephaestion approached carefully, noting how the temperature dropped with each step closer to his friend. "Alexander, my king, perhaps. Still you use that name?" Alexander's laugh held an edge that made even his oldest friend step back. "Still you cling to memories of what I was? Look upon me, truly look, and tell me what you see." And Hephaestion did look, really look, for the first time since Siwa. What he saw made him want to weep or scream or both. The man he had grown up with, the friend he had loved like a brother, was gone. Something else looked out through those golden eyes now. Something ancient and terrible. Something that had been waiting in the spaces between worlds for a vessel strong enough to contain it. "I see," Hephaestion's voice caught. "I see power." That was not meant for mortal flesh to hold. "Yes!" Alexander's smile was brilliant as sunrise and just as terrible to look upon directly. The oracle knew. She saw what I would become, what I had to become. The old gods fade, their time passes. Something new rises in their place. He began to pace the feast hall, his bare feet leaving momentary scorch marks on the marble floor. Each step seemed to distort the air around him, as if reality itself recoiled from his touch. "Clytus thought I had forgotten the Granicus," he continued, his voice taking on that multi-layered quality that made mortal minds want to shut down in self-defense. He thought divine memory would be as weak as human recollection. But I remember everything now. I see all moments, all possibilities, all the threads that bind reality together. He stopped suddenly, turning to face the remaining feast guests with eyes that burned like captured stars. "I remember the moment at Siwa when true sight was granted to me. I remember every death, every victory, every drop of blood spilled in my name, and I remember. Something flickered across his face then, pain, fear. The last traces of humanity crying out as divinity burned it away. But it passed quickly, submerged beneath the tide of power that had possessed him since the oracle's touch. "My king," one of his new Persian advisors dared to speak, still prostrate on the floor. "What would you have us do with what remains?" Alexander glanced at the pile of ash that had been one of his oldest friends, his expression one of scientific curiosity. "Let it stay. Let them all see what happens when mortality challenges divine will." The night grew deeper, but no one dared leave the feast hall without Alexander's permission. They watched in terrified silence as their king performed strange rituals over Clytus's ashes, speaking in languages that made the air itself seem to shiver. "Do you see?" he asked Hephaestion, who alone dared remain close to him in these moments. "Do you see how the threads of fate weave together? Clytus had to die here in this way at this moment. It was written in the patterns before time began." Hephaestion saw nothing but ash and spilled wine, but he nodded carefully. "What do the patterns tell you?" Alexander's smile was distant, dreamy, that this is only the beginning. The true transformation approaches. All these deaths, all these sacrifices, their preparation for something greater. He reached out and touched Hephaestion's face with fingers that still burned with divine fire. "Even you, old friend, even you have your part to play in what comes next." The army's reaction to Clytus's death marked a turning point. The last pretense of Alexander being merely a brilliant young king was stripped away. No mortal commander, no matter how great, could do what they had witnessed in that feast hall. The Macedonian veterans, those who had known Alexander since he was a youth, began requesting transfers to distant garrison duties. The Persian nobles who had grown up with tales of god-kings moved smoothly into the vacuum they left behind. But it was in the quiet moments between public appearances that the true extent of Alexander's transformation became clear. Servants reported hearing him speak to unseen presences in dozens of languages, some of which seemed to make the air itself grow thin. His private quarters became a temple to whatever power had possessed him at Siwa, filled with strange implements and artifacts whose purposes none dared guess. The army's eastward march continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Men who had once moved with proud military precision now crept like suppliants in a temple, careful not to draw divine attention. Officers gave orders in whispers, fearful that normal command voices might be interpreted as challenges to divine authority. Alexander watched it all with the detached interest of a god observing human insects. He had begun wearing a mixture of Persian and Greek royal garments, creating a style all his own that emphasized his otherworldly nature. His public appearances became increasingly theatrical, each entrance choreographed to reinforce his divine status. But something else was changing too, something that even his most devoted followers couldn't help but notice. The divine fire that had consumed Clytus seemed to be consuming Alexander himself from within. He barely ate, barely slept, spending hours in communion with powers only he could perceive. "The mortal shell cracks," he told Hephaestion during one of his midnight wanderings. "With each death, each sacrifice, each moment of divine manifestation, I feel myself becoming more." He laughed, and there was something in the sound that made even his oldest friend want to flee. "The oracle warned me that gods cannot unmake themselves. I understand now, I understand everything." The army pressed deeper into unknown lands, but Alexander's focus seemed increasingly elsewhere. His tactical genius, once precisely targeted, became erratic and strange. He would order elaborate maneuvers based on patterns only he could see, his commands referring to powers and principles that made his officers exchange worried glances. Yet somehow, impossibly, his divine madness produced victories. Cities fell, armies broke, entire regions submitted to his rule. It was as if reality itself had begun bending to accommodate whatever he was becoming. But the price of such power became more evident with each passing day. The human connections that had once grounded Alexander were burning away one by one, consumed by the same divine fire that had reduced Clitus to ash. The world trembled before him, and his march eastward continued. But now it was more than conquest. It was apotheosis, written in blood across the face of history. A god walked among men, and his footsteps left fire in their wake. The mad conquerors. Transformation was nearly complete. All that remained was the final sacrifice, the last burning away of human bonds that would free whatever power had taken root in him at Siwa. And in the darkness of his tent, surrounded by the implements of powers older than civilization, Alexander smiled as he contemplated what that sacrifice would be. 3 days after the great funeral pyre had finally burned out, Alexander vanished into his private quarters, refusing all food and company. For 7 days and nights, his screams echoed through the palace halls as he raved in a dozen languages, holding conversations with Hephaestion's ghost. When he finally emerged, his transformation was complete. The last traces of the brilliant young king who had left Macedonia were gone, replaced by something that his oldest companions could barely recognize. His appearance had changed dramatically. He'd abandoned his carefully cultivated image as the golden warrior king, instead wrapping himself in sheer Persian silks that left him half naked. His legendary hair, once kept immaculately groomed to echo the lion's mane of Heracles, now hung wild and matted around his gaunt face. Most disturbing were his eyes, fever-bright and filled with an intensity that made even hardened veterans look away. The first public audience after his seclusion drew nobles and ambassadors from across the empire, all eager to see what had become of their god-king. The great hall of Babylon fell silent as Alexander entered, his bare feet leaving bloody prints on the marble floor. He'd refused to wear shoes since Hephaestion's death, claiming they separated him from the earth's power. It was the high priest of Marduk who finally dared break protocol, stepping forward to perform the traditional Babylonian blessing. "Great king, the gods!" "Gods?" Alexander's voice cut through the hall like a knife. The priest's words died in his throat as those fever-bright eyes fixed upon him. "What gods do you speak of, priest? What petty powers do you invoke before divine presence made flesh?" The assembled court watched in horrified silence as their king descended from his throne with predatory grace. The priest, who had served 3 generations of Persian kings, found himself backing away from whatever he saw in Alexander's face. "My king," he tried again, "the ancient traditions—" "Traditions?" Alexander's laugh held an edge that made even his most loyal followers flinch. "I am beyond traditions, beyond your small gods and smaller ceremonies." He circled the priest like a wolf, sizing up wounded prey. "Tell me, servant of dead powers, what do your omens say about me? What do your ancient scrolls whisper about the rise of living divinity?" The priest, whether from courage or madness, drew himself up to his full height. "They say that even kings are mortal, great one, that all flesh must bow before the eternal." "Gods!" The crack of the priest's neck breaking echoed off ancient stones that had witnessed 5,000 years of kings and gods. Alexander held the body aloft, his face transformed by a mania that had been growing since Siwa, but had bloomed into full flower with Hephaestion's death. "Look upon me," he commanded the assembled court. "Look with unclouded eyes, and tell me what you see. Am I flesh? Am I mortal? Or am I what your prophecies have whispered, divinity itself come to sweep away the old order?" The priest's body thudded to the marble floor. No one moved to help. They had all seen what happened to those who questioned Alexander's divinity. Since Hephaestion's death, the army that had followed him from Macedonia had watched their brilliant young king transform step by step, first the tactical genius, then the self-proclaimed son of Zeus, then the god-king of Asia. But this was something new, something that made even his most devoted followers exchange worried glances. The days following the priest's execution marked a fundamental shift in Alexander's rule. What had begun as claims of divine heritage now transformed into something more absolute, a complete rejection of all authority save his own. He ordered the removal of every religious idol from Babylon's temples, replacing them with his own image. Priests who protested simply disappeared. Ptolemy, watching from the shadows of the great hall, saw how his king's behavior became increasingly erratic. Alexander would pace for hours, holding animated conversations with unseen presences. His orders grew more grandiose, more disconnected from military or political reality. He commanded the construction of a fleet to circumnavigate Arabia, then countermanded it the next day in favor of plans to march east beyond the known world. "The empire needs borders," one of his generals dared suggest during a war council. "Natural boundaries to defend." Borders? Alexander's laugh held that edge of hysteria that had become more pronounced since Hephaestion's death. Gods do not recognize borders. Divine will knows no boundaries. He swept the carefully prepared maps from the table. Everything under the sun belongs to me. Every kingdom, every people, every soul. Those who accept this truth will prosper, those who deny it. His glance toward the bloodstain where the priest had died made his meaning clear enough. The army that had followed him from Macedonia watched in growing horror as their king's behavior became more extreme. He began requiring elaborate prostration rituals from everyone who entered his presence, not just the Persian proskynesis that had caused such controversy years before, but extended ceremonies that forced men to remain face down for hours while he expounded on his own divinity. Even his appearance reflected the transformation. The practical armor and simple clothing of a Macedonian commander were replaced by increasingly elaborate costumes that mixed elements from every conquered culture. One day he would appear in Persian royal robes, the next in Egyptian pharaonic regalia, then in some bizarre combination that seemed designed to emphasize his separation from normal humanity. "Do you see how they tremble?" he asked Hephaestion's empty chair during one particularly lengthy audience session. He had taken to keeping the chair beside his throne, claiming his friend's spirit offered counsel. "Do you see how they finally understand what walks among them?" His generals learned to recognize the signs of his darkest moods. They came most often at dawn, after nights spent sleepless and raving. His eyes would take on that fevered brightness. That meant someone would likely die before sunset. His commands would become more erratic, his punishments more severe for increasingly minor infractions. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine military review. Alexander had ordered the army assembled in full battle array, 30,000 men standing at attention under the merciless Babylonian sun. For hours he walked among them, muttering to himself in multiple languages, occasionally stopping to stare into a soldier's face as if searching for something only he could see. Then he found what he was looking for. "You." He grabbed a veteran infantryman by the throat. "You still doubt. I see it in your eyes, that mortal questioning, that human hesitation." His voice rose to a shout that carried across the parade. "Ground. Show them what happens to those who harbor doubt in their hearts." The soldier's execution was elaborate, choreographed like a piece of theater. Alexander forced the entire army to watch as he demonstrated what happened to those who questioned his divinity. When it was done, he stood before them, flesh and silk, spattered with blood, his eyes burning with that terrible intensity that had replaced the magnetic charisma of his youth. "I see all," he declared, his voice carrying to every ear. "I know every thought, every doubt, every moment of hesitation in your mortal hearts. Those who embrace divine truth will ascend with me. Those who cling to human limitations, his Aki." Smile was terrible to behold. Those will be burned away in the fire of transformation. The army's character changed after that day. Veterans who had followed Alexander since he was a youth requested transfers to distant garrisons. Their places were filled by new recruits from across the empire, men who had never known him as anything but a living god, who had no memory of the brilliant young king who had left Macedonia with dreams of glory. But it was in his private moments that the full extent of his transformation became clear. His quarters became a maze of shrines and altars, each dedicated to some aspect of his own divinity. He would spend hours performing elaborate rituals, combining elements from every religion they had encountered into ceremonies that seemed designed primarily to demonstrate his power over life and death. "The barrier thins," he told Ptolemy during one of his increasingly rare lucid moments. "The divide between divine and mortal realms grows weaker with each passing day. Soon," his smile held an edge of something that might have been fear, "soon there will be no separation at all." The empire continued to function, carried forward by the momentum of its own massive bureaucracy. Cities fell, provinces submitted, trade flowed. But at its heart, in the great palace of Babylon, something was happening that defied historical precedent. The greatest military commander the world had ever known was systematically dismantling every human connection, every mortal limitation, in his quest to become something more than human. His orders became increasingly bizarre. He commanded the construction of a tower that would reach the heavens, then abandoned the project halfway through in favor of plans to drain the Persian Gulf. Each new scheme was more grandiose than the last, each less connected to physical or political reality. The army watched in silence as their king's behavior became more erratic. His mood swings grew more pronounced, his periods of lucidity shorter. He would issue a series of brilliant tactical commands, demonstrating the military genius that had conquered the known world, then suddenly veer into long monologues about his own divinity that made even his most devoted followers exchange worried glances. "Do you know what I see when I close my eyes?" he asked Ptolemy during one midnight council session. "I see the patterns that bind reality together. I see how divine will shapes the world." His laugh held that edge of hysteria that had become his signature. "The oracle warned me that gods cannot unmake themselves. I understand now. I understand everything." But understanding, it seemed, came at the price of sanity itself. The brilliant tactical mind that had revolutionized warfare became increasingly erratic, focused on patterns and connections that existed only in his fevered imagination. He would spend hours arranging and rearranging models on maps, claiming to see divine significance in their positions. The final transformation came during a ceremony that was supposed to unite the religions of his empire. Alexander had ordered priests from every faith to participate in a ritual of his own design. The great hall of Babylon was packed with representatives from a dozen cultures, each ordered to incorporate their most sacred rites into his new unified worship. But something went wrong. Perhaps it was the incense, perhaps the lack of sleep, perhaps the culmination of whatever fever had been burning in his brain since Siwa. Alexander's behavior became more erratic with each passing hour. His commands grew more impossible, his punishments more severe for any perceived lack of enthusiasm. "You still don't see," he told the assembled priests, his voice taking on that multi-layered quality that marked his deepest manias. "You cling to your small gods, your petty rituals, your mortal limitations. Let me show you true divinity." What followed would be whispered about in taverns and nightmares for generations. Alexander demonstrated exactly what happened to those who clung to old gods in the presence of new divinity. When it was done, when the screaming had stopped and the blood had been cleaned from the marble floors, something fundamental had changed in how the empire viewed its king. The last connection to human authority had been severed. What remained was something new in human history, a man who had transformed himself through sheer will and madness into something that defied mortal description. The price had been his sanity, his humanity, and the loyalty of those who had followed him from Macedonia. But as he often said in those final days, divinity required sacrifice. 5 centuries of Persian civilization burned beneath a blood-red sun, as Alexander stood atop the great stairs of Persepolis, conducting its destruction like a maestro before his orchestra. His fever-bright eyes reflected the inferno as he gestured, with precise, almost delicate movements, directing his men to ensure nothing survived. Each collapsing column, each toppling statue, each screaming beam of ancient cedar played its part in his symphony of devastation. "The third chamber next," he commanded, his voice carrying that edge of hysteria that had become more pronounced since Hephaestion's death. "I want the collapse to flow like water, like wine, like blood." He laughed, the sound brittle as breaking glass. "Let future generations see how gods unmake empires." The great palace complex of Persepolis had stood as the heart of Persian power since Darius the Great raised its first columns 2 centuries before. Its walls had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, had housed the greatest treasures of the ancient world, had symbolized Persian might to all who beheld it. Now it died according to the precise specifications of a madman who claimed divinity. Ptolemy watched from the shadows of a still-standing colonnade, noting how his king's appearance had deteriorated in recent months. Alexander's legendary golden hair hung lank and sweat-soaked around his gaunt face. The simple Macedonian clothing he'd once favored had been replaced by an impossible mixture of Persian royal garments and Greek military equipment, as if he couldn't decide which empire's god-king he was playing at being. "My king," Ptolemy dared to approach as another wing of the palace collapsed in carefully orchestrated ruin. "The men ask, they wonder if perhaps some parts might be preserved, the libraries at least." "Preserved?" Alexander's laugh held that multi-layered quality that made even his oldest companions want to step back. "What need have we of Persian histories now? I am history, I am destiny, I am the only truth that matters anymore." He turned to face his general, and Ptolemy had to fight the urge to flee from whatever burned in those fever-bright eyes. The kike, brilliant young king who had left Macedonia, was gone, burned away by ambition and power, and whatever madness had possessed him since Siwa. What remained was something that even his most devoted followers struggled to recognize. "Bring me the archives," Alexander commanded. "All of them. Every scroll, every tablet, every record of Persian glory. I want them piled before the throne room." His smile was terrible to behold. Let us see how 5 centuries of history burn. The army that had followed him from Macedonia watched in increasingly uneasy silence as their king's behavior became more erratic. Veterans who had known him since youth exchanged worried glances as he ordered priceless artifacts smashed, ancient treasuries looted, centuries of civilization systematically erased. But it was his behavior during the midnight feast that truly marked how far he had fallen into madness. Alexander ordered tables set amongst the ruins, commanding his officers to dine while watching Persepolis burn. The wine flowed freely, too freely, and with each cup, their king's pronouncements became more grandiose, more disconnected from reality. "Look upon my works," he shouted, standing atop an overthrown statue of Darius. "Look how easily gods erase the achievements of mortals. This," he gestured at the burning palace complex, "this was their greatest pride, their monument to earthly power. And what is it now? Ash and memory." None dared remind him that he had spent months living in these same palaces, had adopted Persian customs, had claimed to be the rightful heir to their empire's glory. The Alexander who had sought to unite East and West was gone, replaced by something that seemed intent only on destruction. A timber beam cracked like breaking bone, sending a cascade of sparks into the darkening sky. Alexander raised his wine cup in salute as another section of the palace collapsed, its ancient cedar columns surrendering at last to the flames he had ordered lit. The acrid smoke carried the scent of burning history. Papyrus scrolls, cedar, panels, and the accumulated treasures of 5 centuries all feeding the inferno. "More wine," he commanded, his voice carrying that sharp edge that had become more pronounced since Hephaestion's death. "Let every man drink deep. Let them watch how easily gods erase the works of mortals." The officers gathered for this macabre feast shifted, uneasily on their couches. They had followed Alexander from Macedonia, had witnessed his transformation from brilliant young king to something that none of them quite dared name. But this systematic destruction of Persepolis marked something new, not the hot fury of battle or the calculated cruelty of conquest, but a cold determination to erase history itself. "The Hall of 100 Columns next," he ordered, pointing with his wine cup toward the massive structure that had housed Persian court ceremonies for 2 centuries. "I want it brought down before midnight. Let it serve as backdrop to our revels." Ptolemy exchanged glances with Peucestus, who had recently been appointed Persian satrap. The destruction of a treasury was one thing, but the Hall of 100 Columns contained irreplaceable records, administrative documents vital to governing the empire. "My king," Peucestus ventured carefully, "perhaps some of the archives might be—" "You still think like a satrap," Alexander cut him off, his fever-bright eyes fixing on his officer with unsettling intensity. "Still concerned with mundane matters of governance and record-keeping." He rose unsteadily, wine slopping over the rim of his cup. "Look around you. What need have we of Persian archives? Their time is done. Their history ends here, replaced by something greater." He gestured expansively at the burning ruins, nearly losing his balance. The movement caused his bizarre composite costume to catch the firelight. Persian royal robes worn over Macedonian armor, Greek sword belt supporting a Persian Akhenaki's dagger. Like his mind, his appearance had become an increasingly erratic mixture of East and West order and chaos. "My king," Ptolemy tried, noting how Alexander's hands trembled slightly despite his efforts to appear steady. "The men are tired. Perhaps we might continue the destruction tomorrow." "Tired?" Alexander's laugh held that edge of hysteria that made even his oldest companions want to step back. "Gods do not grow tired. Divine will knows no rest." He raised his voice to carry across the burning courtyard. "Any man who feels fatigue may leave now. Go join those other weaklings who cling to mortal limitations. The rest of you—" His smile was terrible in the firelight. "The rest will bear witness to how divinity reshapes the world." None dared leave. They had all seen what happened to those who questioned Alexander's divinity since Hephaestion's death. Instead, they watched in uneasy silence as their king ordered more wine, more destruction, more elaborate proofs of his power over life and death. The night deepened, but the fires only grew higher. Alexander moved through the ruins like a fever dream, alternating between periods of cold calculation and wild acceleration. One moment he would give precise instructions about how to bring down a particular structure for maximum effect. The next, he would launch into rambling monologues about divine destiny and the transcendence of mortal limitations. "Do you see?" he demanded of no one in particular, as another wing of the palace collapsed. "Do you see how easily the old order burns? How readily the past surrenders to divine will?" He laughed, the sound almost lost in the roar of the flames. "Darius built this to last eternities. His eternities end tonight." The army watched their king with growing concern. Veterans who had known him since youth whispered about the changes they'd seen, how the brilliant tactical mind that had conquered Asia had become increasingly erratic, focused on patterns and connections that existed only in his fevered imagination. But it was his behavior toward his own men that truly marked how far he had fallen. When a young officer stumbled while serving wine, spilling a few drops on Alexander's robes, the king's reaction was instantaneous and terrible. "You dare," he hissed, seizing the boy by the throat. "You dare to stain divine vestments with mortal clumsiness." The feast fell silent, save for the crackle of flames and the officer's desperate gasps for air. Alexander held him aloft with unnatural strength born of madness, his face transformed by a mania that had been growing since Siwa, but had bloomed into full flower with Hephaestion's death. "My king," Ptolemy stepped forward, knowing the risk but unable to watch another loyal soldier die for some imagined slight. "He is one of your best young officers. His father died at Gaugamela, fighting beneath your standard." "His father?" Alexander's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "You think mortal lineage matters now? That human connections still hold meaning?" He released the officer, who collapsed, gasping, to the ground. Let him live then, but let him serve as example. Let all men see the price of failing their God. The punishment he ordered was elaborate, choreographed like a piece of theatre. The young officer was stripped and staked out at the edge of the ruins, positioned so that he could watch the destruction of Persepolis while suffering in the bitter cold of a Persian winter night. "Watch," Alexander commanded his assembled officers. "Watch how divine justice shapes mortal behavior." The feast continued, growing more frenzied as the night deepened. Alexander ordered new entertainments, dancers performing among the burning ruins, musicians playing counterpoint to the sound of collapsing architecture. Each new spectacle was more elaborate than the last, each further disconnected from any sane purpose, but it was what he did next that truly demonstrated how far he had fallen into madness. As midnight approached, Alexander ordered the great throne room of Xerxes cleared of all its remaining treasures. The massive space, once the heart of Persian royal power, was stripped bare, save for the empty throne itself. "Bring the archives," he commanded. "Every scroll, every tablet, every record of Persian glory. Pile them before the throne." His men obeyed, though many cast worried glances at the priceless documents they were handling. 5 centuries of Persian history, administrative records that governed an empire, astronomical observations that dated back to Babylon, all heaped before the throne like common kindling. Alexander mounted the steps to Xerxes' seat with deliberate grace, though those watching closely could see how he had to steady himself against the armrest. The wine, the sleepless nights, the fever that seemed to burn in him constantly now, all were taking their toll, but his voice, when he spoke, carried that terrible clarity that marked his deepest manias. "Do you know what I see when I look at these?" He gestured at the pile of documents. "Not history, not knowledge, not the accumulated wisdom of centuries. I see chains. Chains of memory and tradition that bind men to the past, that keep them from embracing divine truth." He lifted a torch from its bracket, holding it high. "My king," Pukastas tried one last time. "These records, they're needed to govern the empire, to maintain order." "Order." Alexander's laugh echoed off the ancient stones. "I am order. I am law. I am the only truth that matters anymore." He touched the torch to the pile of documents. "Watch how easily the past burns. Watch how readily mortal knowledge surrenders to divine will." The assembled officers watched in horrified silence as centuries of civilization went up in flames. Alexander stood above the conflagration like some ancient god of destruction, his face transformed by the reflected fire and his own burning madness. But something else was burning too, something his officers had begun to notice with growing concern. Alexander's physical strength, once legendary, was visibly failing. His hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the winter chill. And his eyes. His eyes held something new, something that looked almost like fear. "More wine," he commanded, though his cup was already full. "More music, more dancers. Let no man rest until divine will is satisfied." The feast continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Veterans who had followed Alexander since he was a youth began exchanging worried glances. They had seen him in many moods, the cold calculation of the battlefield, the hot fury of combat, the sharp intensity of tactical planning. But this was something new, something that seemed to be consuming him from within. As dawn approached, Alexander's energy seemed to flag. His commands became less frequent, his gestures less precise. But just as his officers dared hope, the destruction might end, he seemed to rally, drawing on some inner reserve of strength or madness. "The sun rises," he announced, his voice carrying that multi-layered quality that marked his deepest manias. "Let it rise on a new world, a world where Persian pride is only memory, where mortal works submit to divine will." He ordered the final wings of the palace complex prepared for burning. The systematic destruction that had taken all night would culminate with the sunrise, a symbolic erasure of the old order, to make way for whatever mad vision consumed him now. But as he stood to give the final commands, something happened that his officers had never seen before. Alexander stumbled, catching himself against a broken column. For just a moment, the mask of divinity slipped, revealing something almost human underneath, something tired and afraid and burning with fever. The moment passed quickly. He drew himself up, covering the weakness with an elaborate gesture toward the rising sun. But his closest companions had seen it. Something was wrong with their king, something that went beyond the divine madness that had possessed him since Siwa. "Let it burn," he commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Let it all burn, and let any man who questions divine will remember this night. Remember how easily gods erase the works of mortals." The sun rose on a changed world. Persepolis, heart of Persian civilization for 5 centuries, was no more. In its place stood smoking ruins, and the man who had ordered its destruction, a man who claimed to be a god, but whose hands shook as he raised his wine cup in final salute to the devastation he had wrought. The army watched in uneasy silence, knowing they were witness to something unprecedented in human history. Their brilliant young king, the greatest military commander the world had ever known, was burning away the very empire he had conquered. And with it, perhaps, the last traces of his own humanity. The price of such destruction remained to be seen, but as Alexander staggered slightly on his way back to camp, as the fever-bright gleam in his eyes took on a new and worrying intensity, some among his oldest companions began to wonder if divine madness might not exact its final price sooner than anyone expected. Blood painted the cracked earth of the Gedrosian desert, as Alexander ordered the entire village executed for failing to acknowledge his divinity properly. The summer sun blazed mercilessly as his soldiers, themselves dying of thirst, carried out their king's commands with mechanical precision. They had learned not to question his orders, no matter how mad, not since he'd crucified an entire cavalry squadron for suggesting they turn back from this death march to nowhere. "Let them serve as markers," Alexander commanded, his voice hoarse from the fever that had gripped him since leaving Persepolis. "Stakes every 100 paces. Let all who follow see what happens to those who deny divine will." His once golden hair hung in sweat-soaked tangles around his gaunt face, and his hands trembled as he gestured toward the horizon. "There. Always. There. The edge of the world awaits us." The army that had conquered the known world was dying. 3 months of forced march through the desert had reduced 60,000 men to barely 40,000. The rest lay bleaching in the sun, their bones marking the path of their king's final descent into absolute madness. Veterans who had followed Alexander since Macedonia watched in horror as he drove them ever onward towards some destination that existed only in his fever dreams. Ptolemy studied his king with growing concern as Alexander swayed slightly in his saddle. The physical deterioration was becoming impossible to hide. The legendary stamina that had once let him march beside his men for days was gone, replaced by trembling hands and a constant sheen of fever sweat on his brow. But it was his eyes that truly terrified his oldest companions. They burned with an intensity that spoke of something consuming him from within. "My king," Ptolemy ventured carefully, noting how Alexander's hand tightened on his sword hilt at the interruption. "The men need water. The last wells were 3 days back." "Water?" Alexander's laugh held that edge of hysteria that had become more pronounced since burning Persepolis. "Gods have no need of water. Divine will sustains us now." He turned to face his general, and Ptolemy had to fight the urge to back away from whatever burned in those fever-bright eyes. "Or do you too doubt, like those others who cling to mortal limitations?" He gestured toward the line of crucified men that marked their path through the desert. The cavalry squadron's commander still lived somehow, his parched voice carrying, on the hot wind, "Please, my king, mercy." Mercy? Alexander's smile was terrible to behold. "I offer something greater than mercy. I offer transformation. Watch how divine will reshapes mortal flesh. Watch how human weakness burns away in the fire of transcendence." The army watched in uneasy silence as their king drew his sword with trembling hands. What followed would haunt witnesses until their dying days, not for its cruelty, though that was absolute, but for the methodical precision with which Alexander demonstrated exactly what happened to those who questioned his divinity. But it was what he did afterward that truly marked how far he had fallen. Standing amid the carnage, swaying slightly as fever and exhaustion took their toll, Alexander began to lecture the corpses on the nature of divine will. His voice took on that multi-layered quality that marked his deepest manias, switching between languages as his mind slipped further from reality. "You see," he demanded of the dead, "you see how easily mortal flesh surrenders to divine purpose, how readily human limitations burn away in the fire of transformation." His laugh echoed across the desert wastes. "This is just the beginning. Wait until you see what comes next. Wait until you see what lies beyond the edge of the world." The night brought no relief from the desert's torment. Alexander paced the command tent like a caged predator, his bare feet leaving bloody prints on Persian carpets as he lectured his increasingly terrified officers on divine cosmology. The fever that had gripped him since Persepolis now burned, so hot that none could bear to stand near him, yet he refused all attempts at treatment. "Look!" He gestured toward maps that existed only in his mind, his trembling hands sketching patterns in the air. "Beyond the outer ocean, where the sun goes to die each night. That's where we're going, where no mortal army has ever trod, where reality itself grows thin and gods walk freely among men." Ptolemy exchanged worried glances with Pseucestus. They had seen their king in many states over the years, the cold calculation of battle planning, the hot fury of combat, the sharp focus of tactical genius. But this was something new, something that seemed to be consuming him from within. "My king," Pseucestus ventured carefully, "the men speak of omens. The sacrificial fires refuse to catch, the entrails speak of doom." "Omens!" Alexander's laugh held an edge that made even his oldest companions flinch. What are omens to a god? What are prophecies to one who reshapes reality by will alone? He seized a water skin from a nearby table, holding it up like evidence in a trial. "They say we need water, that men cannot march without it. Watch how divine will sustains us." He hurled the precious water into the desert sand, an act of defiance against natural law that made his officers blanch. In a land where men killed each other over cupfuls of moisture, such waste was worse than blasphemy. But it was what he did next that truly marked how far he had fallen into madness, standing in his tent's entrance, swaying slightly as fever and exhaustion took their toll. Alexander began to prophesy. His voice took on that multi-layered quality that marked his deepest manias, switching between languages as his mind slipped further from reality. "I see it all now," he declared to the assembled officers. "The patterns, the connections, the threads that bind reality together. Beyond the desert lies the outer ocean. Beyond the ocean, the edge of the world. And beyond that..." His smile was terrible in the lamplight. "Beyond that lies transformation, the final burning away of mortal limitations." The army's senior officers listened in growing horror as their king outlined his plans. They had followed him beyond the edges of any map, had watched him reduce ancient Persepolis to ash, had carried out commands that haunted their dreams. But this was madness beyond even divine pretension. "We march at dawn," Alexander commanded, though dawn was still hours away. "Every man carrying no more than 3 days' water. Divine will shall provide the rest." He turned to face his generals, and something in his fever-bright eyes made even the bravest step back. "Those who doubt may remain here. Their bodies will mark our path back from glory." None dared object openly. They had all seen what happened to doubters since Persepolis. But as they left the command tent, the whispers began. Whispers that grew, louder as they spread through the camp, carried on the hot desert wind along with the moans of dying men. The army that had conquered the known world was finally reaching its breaking point. Veterans who had followed Alexander since he was a youth now spoke openly of rebellion. The Macedonian phalanx, backbone of his military might, had lost half its strength to the desert's mercies. Even the Persian troops used to harsh conditions were deserting in growing numbers. But it was Alexander's physical deterioration that truly terrified his oldest companions. The legendary stamina that had once let him march beside his men for days was gone, replaced by trembling hands and a constant sheen of fever sweat on his brow. His legendary golden hair hung in matted tangles, and his once piercing gaze now held a wild, unfocused quality that spoke of internal fires consuming him. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it fresh horrors. Alexander ordered the army's remaining supplies burned. Divine will shall provide, and commanded a forced march toward the horizon. Men dropped like flies in the merciless heat, their bodies left where they fell to mark the path of their king's final descent into absolute madness. But it was what he did at midday that finally broke the army's spirit. When a veteran phalanx commander dared suggest they at least wait out the worst of the heat, Alexander's reaction was immediate and terrible. "You dare?" His voice carried that edge of hysteria that made even his oldest companions want to flee. "You dare suggest that divine will submit to mortal weakness?" He drew his sword with trembling hands. "Let me show you how gods deal with doubt." What followed would haunt witnesses until their dying days. Alexander demonstrated exactly what happened to those who questioned divine will. His movements precise, despite his obvious physical weakness. When it was done, when the screaming had stopped and the blood was soaking into the desert sand, he turned to face his assembled army. "Watch," he commanded, his voice carrying that multi-layered quality that marked his deepest manias. "Watch how divine justice reshapes mortal behavior." The army watched in terrified silence as their king ordered the dead man's unit to carry their commander's remains forward. "Let his corrupt flesh mark our path to glory." Those who hesitated joined their commander in death, their bodies added to the growing trail of markers, pointing toward whatever destination existed in Alexander's fevered dreams. But something was changing in how the army responded to these displays. Where once there had been awe mixed with fear, now there was only horror. Where there had been faithful execution of divine commands, now there was hesitation. The breaking point was approaching, and everyone could feel it. It came 3 days later, when Alexander ordered the army to march straight into a dust storm that turned the horizon black. Standing in his stirrups, despite obvious weakness, he began another of his increasingly incomprehensible speeches about divine will and mortal limitations. "Look," he commanded, pointing toward the wall of approaching death. "Look how reality parts before divine purpose. The very elements submit to our advance." But this time something different happened. A voice called out from the ranks, "No more!" The sound seemed to freeze the very air. Alexander turned in his saddle, his fever-bright eyes scanning the fur. Assembled troops like a predator seeking prey. "Who dares?" "We all dare." The voice came from Conqueror, one of his oldest and most trusted commanders. The veteran stepped forward, his face set in grim lines. "We followed you across the known world, followed you beyond the edges of any map. But this," he gestured at the approaching storm, "this is not divine will. This is madness." For a moment, absolute silence fell over the army. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Alexander stared at his old friend, his face transformed by something that went beyond mere rage or divine pretension. Madness? His laugh held frequencies that made men's bones ache. "You think this madness? Let me show you madness." He spurred his horse forward, sword drawn, clearly intending to add another example to his trail of corpses. But this time, the army didn't part before him. This time, the Macedonian phalanx lowered its spears, forming a wall of bronze points between their king and their commander. Alexander reined in so hard his horse reared, nearly unseating him in his weakened state. "You dare? You dare?" His voice rose to a shriek that carried over the rising wind. "I am divine will made flesh. I am destiny itself. I am—" "You are sick, my king." Ptolemy's voice cut through the hysteria like a blade through flesh. "The fever burns in you. Let us help you. Let us turn back to—" "Back!" Alexander's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Gods do not go back. Divine will knows only forward. Forward to glory. Forward to transformation. Forward to—" The rest was lost as he suddenly swayed in his saddle, the fever finally overwhelming even his legendary constitution. As he toppled from his horse, as his officers rushed forward to catch their falling king, the wall of black dust on the horizon seemed to pause in its advance. Later some would say it was an omen. Others would claim divine intervention. But in that moment, as Alexander's oldest companions carried his burning body back to the command tent, all anyone felt was relief. Relief and a creeping horror at how close they had come to following their god-king right over the edge of the world. The army made camp there, in the shadow of the dust storm that never quite reached them. For 3 days and nights, Alexander burned with fever in his tent, his ravings growing more incomprehensible with each passing hour. He spoke in languages that none could recognize, held conversations with long-dead companions, issued commands to armies that existed only in his mind. But it was what he said in his rare lucid moments that truly terrified his companions. Looking at Ptolemy with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to bone, he whispered, "I understand now. The oracle warned me, but I wouldn't listen. Gods cannot unmake themselves, but fever can unmake gods." On the 4th day, the fever broke. Alexander slept for the first time in what seemed like weeks, his body finally still, his breathing regular. When he woke, some of his officers dared hope they might see their old commander again, the brilliant young king who had led them from Macedonia. But when those fever-bright eyes opened, when that terrible smile curved his cracked lips, they knew the truth. The fever had burned away something vital, something human. What remained was a husk filled with divine fire, a vessel for something that had no place in the world of men. "We march," he commanded, his voice barely a whisper but carrying that same edge of madness. "The edge of the world awaits." But this time, for the first time in the history of Alexander's conquest, his army refused to move. 10,000 Macedonian veterans stood firm, their spears planted in the desert sand, their faces set in grim lines. "No," Craterus spoke for them all, "no more marching to madness, no more divine will, no more." Alexander's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of rage, instead of divine pronouncements, he began to laugh, and laugh, and laugh. The sound went on far too long, containing harmonics that made even the bravest want to cover their ears and pray to whatever god still dared exist in Alexander's presence. When the laughter finally stopped, when those fever-bright eyes surveyed his rebellious army, something new entered his voice, something that might have been fear. "You think you can stop divine will?" he whispered, but every ear heard him clearly. "You think mortal weapons can cage a god?" His smile was terrible to behold. Watch. Watch what happens when divinity is denied its purpose. What followed would be spoken of only in whispers by those who survived to tell of it. Alexander demonstrated exactly what happened when divine will met mortal resistance, his actions driven by a madness that had burned away the last traces of human restraint. But this time, this final time, the army stood firm. They watched their god-king break himself against their resolve, watched divine will shatter against mortal determination. And in the end, as Alexander collapsed once more into fever's embrace, they turned their faces toward home. The edge of the world would have to wait. The mad conqueror's final advance had been stopped not by enemy armies or natural barriers, but by the very men who had followed him beyond the edges of any map. The price would be paid in rivers of blood, in shattered loyalties and broken oaths. But as the army began its long retreat from the desert's edge, as they carried their burning king back toward civilization, they knew they had witnessed something unprecedented in human history. They had seen a god break against mortal will, and somehow, impossibly, they had survived to tell the tale. Blood struck white marble like a prophecy fulfilled, as Alexander, conqueror of Asia and self-proclaimed god, collapsed during the morning sacrifice at Babylon's great temple. The crimson spray from his nose painted ancient stones that had witnessed 5,000 years of kings and gods, but never one quite like this, a being of pure will and madness, whose collapse seemed to shake the very foundations of empire. His generals rushed forward, their boots slipping in the mingled blood of sacrifice and king, their faces masks of concern that barely concealed the calculation beneath. Each pair of hands that helped lift their fallen god-king already reached metaphorically for his crown. Each whispered word of worry carried undertones of succession and scheme. "The fever burns too hot," Ptolemy muttered, his hand jerking back from Alexander's forehead as if scalded. "He needs to be moved to..." "The palace," Perdiccas cut in smoothly, already taking charge. My physicians," Pusestas corrected with silk-covered steel in his voice, "as satrap of Babylon." But their maneuvering was interrupted by a sound that made even hardened veterans step back. Alexander's laugh, sharp as broken glass, carrying that edge of hysteria that had marked his deepest manias since Siwa. His fever-bright eyes snapped open, fixing on his generals with terrible clarity. "Vultures," he whispered, though every ear in the vast temple heard him clearly, already circling, already tasting blood on the wind. His smile was terrible to behold. "But gods do not die so easily. Let me show you." He tried to rise, to demonstrate once more how divine will transcended mortal limitation. But this time, this final time, his body betrayed him. The strength that had driven armies beyond the edges of maps, that had broken cities and reshaped empires, failed him utterly. He collapsed back into his general's arms, blood flowing freely now from nose and mouth. "The palace," he managed through crimson-stained teeth. "Let all men see, let them witness." What followed would be remembered as the beginning of the end, not just of Alexander's life, but of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The procession through Babylon's streets became a theater of power's fragility, as the man who had proclaimed himself God was carried on a litter like any mortal invalid. The crowd that gathered to watch their divine king's passage stood in uneasy silence. They had seen Alexander in many guises over the years, the brilliant commander, the merciless conqueror, the god-king who reshaped reality through sheer force of will. But this was something new, something that made even those who had never dared doubt his divinity exchange worried glances. In the palace, the vultures gathered closer. Generals who had followed Alexander since Macedonia positioned themselves carefully in the sick room, each stance and placement calculated for maximum political advantage. Physicians were summoned and dismissed based not on their skill, but on their patron's influence. Even the servants who changed the god-king's sweat-soaked sheets were chosen for their factional loyalties. But it was Alexander's behavior in those first hours that truly marked how far divinity had fallen. His fever-driven ravings switched between dozens of languages, some so ancient that none present could understand them. He held lengthy conversations with Hephaestion's ghost, issued commands to armies that existed only in his mind, prophesied dooms that made even the most hardened warriors pale. "You see?" he demanded of empty air, his voice carrying that multi-layered quality that had marked his deepest manias. "You see how the threads unravel? How reality frays at the edges when gods withdraw their will?" The night brought no relief. Alexander's fever burned hotter than the desert they'd left behind, his sweat-soaked sheets requiring constant changing as his body tried to expel whatever fire consumed him from within. The great bedchamber of Babylon's palace, where Nebuchadnezzar himself had once slept, now witnessed something unprecedented, a god failing against mortal limitation. "Bring me my armor," he commanded during one of his more lucid moments, his voice barely a whisper but carrying that same edge of divine pretension. The army must see, must know their God still walks among them. His generals exchanged glances over his burning body. They had seen him in many states over the years, the cold calculation of battle planning, the hot fury of combat, the sharp intensity of tactical genius. But this was something new, something that made even those who had followed him since youth want to look away. "My king," Ptolemy ventured carefully, noting how Alexander's hands trembled as they plucked at sweat-soaked sheets. "Perhaps when the fever breaks?" Alexander's laugh held harmonics that made even veteran commanders step back. "You think divine fire can break? That mortal illness can cage a god." He tried to rise, his once powerful body betraying him utterly. "Help me up, let me show them. Let me show you all." What followed would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. Alexander, who had conquered the known world through sheer force of will, could not even stand without support. The legendary frame that had led charges and scaled walls now trembled like a newborn colt. But it was his eyes that truly terrified them, fever-bright, and filled with something between fury and fear, as if he finally understood what was happening to him. They managed to get him into his armor, though the once perfect fit hung loose on his wasted frame. The golden breastplate that had gleamed at the head of armies now served only to emphasize how much weight he'd lost. His legendary hair, once, compared to a lion's mane, hung in sweat-soaked tangles around his gaunt face. "To the great hall," he commanded, though he could barely support his own weight. Let them all see." The procession through the palace became a theater of power's fragility. Servants pressed themselves against walls, hiding their faces as their divine king stumbled past. Guards, who had once proudly worn his livery, now exchanged worried glances, their hands tightening on spear shafts as they witnessed divinity's descent into mere mortality. But it was in the great hall itself that the final transformation became clear. Alexander, supported between Ptolemy and Perdiccas, faced his assembled officers with whatever strength he could muster. His voice, when he spoke, tried to carry that same tone of divine command that had driven armies beyond the edges of maps. "Look upon your God," he began, but the words dissolved into a coughing fit that brought up blood. Dark droplets spattered the marble floor, each one a prophecy of empire's end. When he could speak again, his voice held something new, something that might have been fear. "The divine fire burns," he managed, though every word seemed to cost him. "Burns hotter than mortal flesh can contain. Soon." His legs buckled, forcing his supporters to take more of his weight. "Soon you will see what happens when divinity transcends its mortal shell." But his body betrayed him one final time. Before he could finish his speech, before he could demonstrate whatever proof of godhood he'd planned, Alexander collapsed completely. The sound of his armor striking marble echoed through the great hall like fate's own hammerfall, marking the moment when divine pretension finally surrendered to human frailty. They carried him back to his chambers, his generals already arguing over who had the right to command the palace guards, who should summon which physicians, who would speak for their fallen king. Alexander drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever-driven ravings becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. "Hephaestion," he called to empty air. "Hephaestion, do you see? The threads unravel, the pattern frays. Reality itself rebels against divine will." His oldest companions watched in growing horror as their king's mind slipped further from sanity. He spoke in languages that hadn't been heard since Babylon was young, issued commands to armies that existed only in his fever dreams, prophesied dooms that made even the most hardened warriors pale. But it was in his rare lucid moments that the true horror became clear. Looking at Ptolemy with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to bone, he whispered, "I understand now. The oracle warned me, but I wouldn't listen. Gods cannot unmake themselves, but mortality unmakes everything." The army gathered outside the palace walls, 30,000 men standing in uneasy silence as rumors spread about their divine kings, a condition. Veterans who had followed Alexander since Macedonia traded worried whispers with Persian troops who had never known him as anything but a god. The empire seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if divinity could triumph over human limitation one final time. Inside the palace, the vultures gathered closer. Generals who had once competed for Alexander's favor now positioned themselves for the coming struggle over his legacy. Maps were studied not for military purposes, but for how empire might be divided. Messengers were dispatched to distant provinces, carrying carefully coded warnings about the need to secure borders and treasure houses. Alexander watched it all through fever-bright eyes, his divine madness giving way to moments of terrible clarity. "See how they circle," he whispered to Hephaestion's ghost. "See how quickly divine authority frays when gods show weakness." His condition deteriorated rapidly as summer heat baked Babylon's walls. The fever that had started in his gut now seemed to consume him from within, burning away what remained of the brilliant young king who had left Macedonia with dreams of glory. His physicians, when they dared approach, spoke in worried whispers about symptoms they'd never encountered before. "The divine fire burns too hot," Alexander told them during one of their examinations. "Mortal flesh was never meant to contain it. The oracle knew. She saw this moment." His laugh held that edge of hysteria that had marked his deepest manias. She saw how gods die, but it was what he did next that truly marked how far divinity had fallen. In a moment of seeming clarity, Alexander commanded his generals to gather close. They came eagerly, each hoping this might be the moment when succession was decided, when divine authority passed to mortal hands. Instead, they found themselves audience to something unprecedented, a god trying to bargain with death itself. "Look," Alexander commanded, his voice barely a whisper but carrying that same tone of absolute authority that had driven armies beyond the edges of maps. "Look how reality bends, how divine will reshapes." He tried to rise, to demonstrate whatever proof of godhood he'd planned, but his body betrayed him one final time. The collapse was absolute. Whatever strength had let him maintain divine pretense finally failed, leaving him trembling and mortal on sweat-soaked sheets, his fever-bright eyes fixed on something only he could see, as he whispered, "The pattern breaks. The threads unravel. Reality itself rebels." His generals exchanged worried glances over his burning body. They had seen him in many states, but this was something new. This was a god facing human death, and the sight made even the most hardened warriors want to look away. The night deepened, but Alexander's ravings only grew worse. He spoke to long-dead companions as if they stood beside his bed, issued commands to armies that existed only in his mind, prophesied dooms that made even his most loyal followers exchange worried glances. But it was in his final lucid moment that the true horror became clear. Looking at his assembled generals with eyes that burned with fever and fear, he whispered, "I see it now. See what the oracle meant. Gods cannot unmake themselves, but death unmakes everything." Then his voice failed entirely, leaving only the sound of labored breathing in the great chamber. His generals leaned closer, straining to hear. If divine will might have one final command, one last proclamation for the ages. Instead, they heard something that would haunt them until their dying days, the sound of a god weeping. Alexander, conqueror of Asia and self-proclaimed divinity, spent his final hours in mortal fear. The brilliant mind that had reshaped the known world dissolved into fever dreams and half-coherent prophecies. The voice that had commanded armies fell silent save for occasional whimpers of pain. When the end came, it came not with divine proclamations or supernatural displays, but with the quiet simplicity of human death. Alexander's fever-bright eyes fixed on something only he could see. His cracked lips moved in what might have been a final command or a prayer. And then, silence. The greatest empire the world had ever known held its breath for one eternal moment. Then, before their king's body could cool, the vultures began their dance in earnest. Generals who had knelt before divine authority now stood straight-backed, their hands on sword hilts as they eyed one another across the deathbed. The empire Alexander had forged through will and madness began to fracture, even as his physicians confirmed what everyone already knew. The god-king was dead, and with him died the force of personality that had held together conquests stretching from Macedonia to India. But it was what happened next that truly marked the end of an era. As his generals argued over succession and territory, as armies began positioning themselves for the inevitable civil wars, something unprecedented occurred in human history. The world watched a god die, and in his death demonstrated once and for all the price of divine ambition. The mad conqueror's legacy would be written not in the empire he built, for that would shatter within months of his death, but in the lesson his end taught to all who followed. Even gods must bow to human limitation. Even divine will must surrender to mortal death. In the great palace of Babylon, where Alexander's body lay cooling on sheets, still damp with fever sweat, his empire died with him. The vultures circled closer, their wings casting shadows over the greatest conquest in human history. The price of divinity, it seemed, was paid not just in the moment of death, but in the shattering of everything left behind. But as Alexander had often said in those final days, when fever stripped away pretense and left only truth, gods cannot unmake themselves, but death unmakes everything.
This is the end of this tale. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe. I wish you the best.